Good morning. My name is Neel Kashkari. I'm President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. On behalf of all of my colleagues at the Minneapolis Fed, thank you and we welcome you for joining us for this Regional Economics Conference. 6 or so years ago, we started this series where we invite experts from around the 9th Federal Reserve District. The 9th District is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin. That's a very large geography of America. And my colleagues and I spend a lot of time traveling across the region to learn what's happening in the regional economy. And then I bring those insights back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks for FOMC meetings. Well, we also said, let's invite experts from around those states to come to us and share their outlooks for their own regional and state economies. And that's the purpose of this conference. So we're really appreciative of all of the high-quality speakers and experts that we've brought together today. We're excited to hear from them and learn from them. As part of the series, we also have a keynote speaker, which is often a CEO of a major company in the region or sometimes an elected official from the region to give us their outlook on our regional economy and on the economy that they operate in for their businesses. And today, I'm really excited that we have a terrific leader, a global leader, who's based here in Minnesota, Mike Roman, the CEO and chairman of 3M. Mike became CEO of 3M in 2018 after a long career at 3M and chairman of the board in 2019. I'm going to turn it over to Mike in a moment. We're going to hear some opening remarks from him. And then Mike and I are going to have a conversation about 3M, about our regional economy, about the global economy, and what he is seeing as they operate all around the world. One other thing about Mike that I'm excited about is he's a fellow engineer, Big Ten guy. He went to University of Minnesota for electrical engineering. I went to University of Illinois for mechanical engineering. And so I'm always happy to be in the company of another engineer. And so thank you all for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Mike, welcome to the Minneapolis Fed.
Yeah, Neel, good morning. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's my pleasure to be part of the conversation. And like you, it's great to be talking with a fellow engineer. I appreciate the chance to just talk a little bit about where we are as we start 2023. And I would say, 2022 was an important year for us. We took a number of decisions and actions that are foundational for 2023 and really our future. It started at the beginning of the year. We made decisions to allocate capital to priorities in growth areas, in productivity, and importantly in sustainability. And those commitments were something that we built on and followed through as we went through the year. We also took a number of portfolio actions. We completed the divestiture of our food safety business. We also announced in July a spin of our healthcare business, a little over $8 billion in revenue, one of our 4 business groups that make up 3M today. Both are transformational in our portfolio and important for how we think about creating value as a company as we go forward. We also, like many companies, we took on the challenges of the year, the supply chain disruptions, managing inflation, the geopolitics that we faced. We exited our operations in Russia as one of the decisions. We also took on some of our litigation challenges that we face as a company. We shifted our strategy, working to resolve some litigation matters ahead. We also, at the end of the year, made an important announcement, which is to exit the manufacturing of our fluorochemical portfolio by the end of 2025. And this was an important decision for the future of 3M and something that will create a strong foundation for us as we move forward. So important year, set us up for being well positioned as we come into 2023. So I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, you touched on a few things. And, Mike is one of the people that I call pretty often and just say, hey, what's happening around the world? What are you seeing? Especially when supply disruptions started taking place and really started showing up all around the world. And I really appreciate some of the insights you shared with us and my colleagues. Why don't we start there? Supply chains. How are you seeing the global supply environment? Are supply chains getting better? Where are we relative to normal?
Yeah, as we came into last year, we talked about this a number of times. We expected, or maybe we're more hopeful that supply chains would start to get better as we got into the second half of the year. And we saw, I would say, disruptions persist as we went through the year. It was, for us, we're a manufacturer. We have 150 manufacturing sites around the world. Our manufacturing model, we put our manufacturing capabilities close to our customers. So we manufacture most of what we sell in the regions of the world in those regions. And that's true whether it's Asia, Europe, Latin America, or the US. And maybe the one exception of note is the US. We are a net exporter out of the US. We export about $5 billion worth of goods out of US factories. So it's about 40% of our revenue in US and about 55% of our production value is in the US. So the supply chain impacted us in some unique ways. Probably the biggest challenge was a disruption in raw materials that we saw, and that persisted through the year. It started to get better as we came into the second half of the year. So you're starting to see some improvements in raw material availability. Still some specialty raw materials that are challenging, but more broadly, we're seeing some easing. And you can see it in measures like our backlog. Our backlog has been improving as we came through the second half of the year. That model that I just described, logistics is important. Moving goods from the US into the rest of the world was an important part of that. So there was a lot of talk about container ships into the Los Angeles port. We were often on the other side looking to export. We ran into the same congestion, but it was challenging. We saw limits in over-the-road kind of capacity as we went through the year. We were doing some extraordinary things, chartering more aircraft to get to customers. We serve customers that are in industries like electronics and automotive where you can't take their lines down. You've got to have products there in time. And so we took some extraordinary measures. We actually set up a new distribution center on the East Coast to be able to serve some of the changes in the global ocean-going freight. So a number of things that we had to do, and I would say we invested considerable resources and dollars in adjusting to those supply chains. Again, as we got to the second half of the year, it started to ease. We still see some challenges. Logistics are getting better. And I would say, importantly, on inflation, we also saw inflation continue at levels and broaden out as we went through the year, higher than we estimated we would see as we came into the year. We do see some areas where we're starting to see deceleration in inflation. Certainly, cost of logistics is one of those that we're watching closely, and all of us are watching that closely as we come into the new year.
Yeah, and I'm definitely want to get to inflation. Just staying on supply chains for a moment. One of the big challenges that I saw for us, but also for businesses all around the world, is trying to decide, are these changes going to be sustained? So I'm just curious, when you think about restructuring your logistics to serve the East Coast because of these different traffic patterns, lack of a better word, how did you think about it? Is this going to be a lasting change, or is this something we just need to do for the next couple of years and then it's going to revert back to the West Coast?
Yeah, I would say our supply chains, we're in an important phase of really stepping into new models in our supply chains. Part of it is the change that comes from the digitalization of your supply chains. Part of it is what our customers are doing with their supply chains. And I would say our customers have adjusted their supply chains over time, and we adjust with them. That regional model that I talked about gives us flexibility. I think coming through the pandemic, maybe coming through the disruptions over the last year, it reinforced the strengths of being regional with our capabilities. We can adjust to changes in our supply chains. I think change is going to be the operative word here as we look at supply chains. They're going to continue to evolve and change. I think we will continue to evolve and change our supply chains in response. Whether we stay with the distribution model we have today or we make adjustments as we see the dynamics change in front of us, that's really going to depend on more of our customers and where they take their manufacturing, where they take their demand.
Got it. Thank you. Why don't we shift a little bit and talk about labor availability. We were hoping, I would say my colleagues at the Federal Reserve, that we'd see a bigger labor response, meaning a lot more workers come back in. We've been wrestling with where do the workers go? More than 1 million Americans, of course, died from COVID, which is tragic human loss, but also lost capacity for the U.S. economy. A lot of workers retired early. There's also been a real curbing of immigration into America. All of those things are exacerbating labor availability. How have you navigated it, and how do you see the labor market today?
Yeah, and so take the U.S. market as a good example. So we have 80 manufacturing sites in 29 states. So we're seeing a broad view of labor and our ability. And we have a little over half of our employees are in factories. So it's an interesting place to start and think about labor. we have typically been one of the leading employers in the communities where we're located in those 29 states. As we came through the last couple of years, we saw what every company's seeing: increased competition for labor, and having to think differently about recruiting. Even in our factories, it was typically a very local recruiting of labor. They've broadened out how they look to recruit labor from wider regions, and that's been successful for us. So we were, as we started the year, two dynamics were last year, 2022. As we started the year, we were seeing absenteeism from the Omicron outbreak that we were going through, and we were seeing increased competition. And so we were focused on adding labor. We were successful as we went through, probably through March, to be able to step up, change our compensation, recruit more broadly. And so we've been pretty successful in managing that. We have, like everyone, we're facing elevated turnover rates from pre-pandemic for sure, but we've been able to manage that with some new directions in our recruiting and in our compensation. And I would say in the way we work, we implemented what we call Work Your Way, which gives flexibility to our workforce. So it's beyond the factories. There's a lot of competition for talent, and increasingly so over the last few years, and also elevated levels of turnover. So our model for Work Your Way gives flexibility to our workforce. It's flexibility first, based on trust, based on what enables us to be the best, both at an individual level, but also in our teams and our businesses. And that has been, I think, an advantage in being able to retain and recruit talent and attract talent to 3M.
And I guess a couple follow-up questions. Are you seeing any, we're very focused on wage growth, how tight is the labor market? Are you seeing any softening in the labor market in the last several months or the last 6 months? Is it notable or not so much?
We watch it closely. We haven't seen a softening. I think actually we'll see continued elevated increases in pay as we come into the new year. We expect that to continue at now. And so we saw that in last year, and we'll see it again, I think, in the compensation increases that we have as we come into 2023.
And as you look around the world, because you operate all around the world, is this dynamic pretty similar, pretty consistent in all the markets you operate in, or are there big regional variations?
There's been a tightening of the labor force globally. The U.S. is pronounced in some way, just what we saw coming through the last year. It tends to go with the economy as we look forward. So we're seeing, I think, strong competition for labor in areas like Asia. In other areas, as the economy is slow, we've been pretty stable.
Got it. Okay, why don't we turn to something you did touch on already, which is inflation and the outlook for inflation. Obviously, my colleagues and I have been surprised at how high inflation ran up and how persistent it has been. That's why we adjusted our monetary policy very aggressively. I'm just curious how you look at inflation now, what you all are experiencing, and as you plan for the future, what are you embedding in your plans?
Yeah, and I would say something we talked about. We came into last year expecting a level of inflation. We put it in for our material inflation, our logistics inflation. We really laid out a number for our investors. We said between $350, $450 million of headwinds from inflation in the year. It ended up being close to double that. Wow. And it was really a dynamic where it broadened out. We saw it broaden out into services. We saw it broaden out into third-party manufacturing in a bigger way than we anticipated. So we saw that dynamic as we went through the year. Everyone's hoping there's some deceleration as we come through the end of the year. We're still planning for some inflation, and certainly the year-over-year change in the first half of the year, we're still going to see the inflation that we saw in the second half of 2022 play out in the first half of next year. And we've managed it with a number of actions. We've focused a lot on productivity in our plants and driving strategies like dual sourcing. We, in our broad portfolio of product categories, we had an opportunity to really broaden out our sourcing strategy, and so that was an important part of it. We took actions really around pricing to manage it as well. And so we had strong pricing that helped manage some of the inflation as we went through the year too. And that varies across our different businesses.
Yeah.
We have a retail business, we have a healthcare business, we have industrial businesses. It's a different dynamic across each of those. So we're well positioned, I would say, to manage what we see in that inflation. We will be watching it closely as we get closer to laying out our 2023. We have an earnings call coming up in 11 days, and we'll be talking more about our view for the new year at that time.
You know, one of the comments that some other businesses in the region have shared with me is they've been surprised how they've been able to pass on prices to their customers. Some of these are consumer-oriented businesses, but typically they would raise prices, they would see an immediate reduction in demand and in volumes because it just, the response was very elastic. And they said what's been different in the last couple of years is they've seen their costs go up a lot, they've turned around and passed those costs on, and customers have been very willing to take it. Curious if that resonates with what you all are seeing.
I would say we've managed it well, and we have seen that the price changes that we've implemented to manage inflation have been, accepted in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. Again, our dynamics are a little different. I would say it's always difficult to raise price in retail, in the retail marketplace. Healthcare is, a number of our products are under contracts and bids, so you have cycles to your contracts. We have that in other areas as well, in our OEM direct businesses in areas like transportation, automotive, electronics. And then we have a significant part of our portfolio is in B2B kinds of businesses. Industrial is the biggest part of that, where we're working through distributors, and there you have a little better flexibility to manage price on an ongoing basis. And so we were able to, in each of those, as we came through 2021, get on top of that. So when we entered 2022, we had a pretty good balance between our pricing that we had in the marketplace and the inflation that we were seeing. We were able to manage a significant portion of that inflation that we were seeing.
Got it. Well, why don't we turn to, you've talked to me a little bit about, and you mentioned it here today, the transformation of 3M that's underway. And I'm curious, that transformation, was that caused by the pandemic? Is that a response to the pandemic? It was something pre-pandemic? A lot of businesses say to me, hey, we're trying to figure out what the future looks like and how we need to make long-term adjustments. And so I'm just curious how the pandemic fits into the transformation.
Yeah, we launched a pretty significant transformation change, the first real big step in our transformation journey before the pandemic. So we had realigned our business groups around the commercial models that they are, the go-to-market models in 2019. As we came into 2020, we went to a global business-led model. It was a pretty significant change for 3M Company. We had in the past managed our businesses at a country level and at a global business level, and it was really a collaborative kind of approach to managing strategy and execution and portfolio, and we went to a global-led model as we started the year. Importantly, we also made a change in our operating model, so our supply chain. We had different models for our supply chain around the world. We had a different model in the US versus Europe versus some of the other countries around the world. We went to a common model. Really, you think about it as commercialize, plan, source, make, deliver. We went to a common model across that supply chain. And we made a big step ahead of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic probably, in some ways, it took advantage of some of those changes, or we took advantage of it during the pandemic, but we also slowed down some of the change progression that we expected to make. So the pandemic then brought a lot of other trends. Digital accelerated. I would say changes in our customers accelerated. And so now we are taking the next step in where we go with especially our supply chain model to serve those changes in the world that have come through the pandemic. So as we look at 2023, we are accelerating the changes around the supply chain in particular, but also really taking the learning from the last few years into our commercial model. So it's an ongoing. They continue to adapt and change to the dynamics that we're seeing coming out of the pandemic. It's also shows up in our investment strategy, our priorities for where we see the growth opportunities, and making sure we're prioritizing those trends that we're seeing as we came out of the pandemic and as we look forward.
Got it. And I know you had mentioned to me earlier that you just convened your top leaders from around the world here in the Twin Cities. Any big takeaways from bringing everybody back in person for that conference?
Well, it's energizing. You get everybody together. We kick off the year every year with a leadership conference. It's the first time since 2020. We actually, right before the pandemic, we had our conference. It's the first time we've been all together as a leadership conference. And this is more than 300 of our global leaders coming together. It was really around two things. It's the transformation agenda that we're leading forward and everybody's responsibility and role in that. It's also about getting ready to deliver in 2023, deliver for our customers and our shareholders, and the actions, lining around that. So the energy was important, and it helped us, I think, really get everyone focused on what's ahead and aligning to it. So these are the moments that matter. We talk in our flexible work your way model. They're still important to come together around moments that matter. There's moments that matter in how you operate your functions and your businesses. There's moments that matter in leadership, and this was one of those moments.
Yeah, I can tell you just from our experience here, being back, it makes a big difference, especially when you have leaders and teams back together in person. The other thing that was noteworthy is the Federal Reserve is the FOMC meetings every 6 weeks in Washington. These are very serious. People come exceptionally well prepared. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we had to learn how to do it remotely. It's amazing how much is lost. And when we finally were able to come back in person, I think it was March of last year, everybody just breathed a big sigh of relief. It's like, okay, finally we can have this engagement. And it just, there's definitely something lost over online. And so I understand it.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this earlier. It's getting that right balance in the flexibility and taking advantage, I think, of the remote capabilities. It's certainly, as a global company, it's enabled communications and connections that you can't get to in person. Just the frequency and the ease of being able to do that. On the other hand, those moments that matter in person, they make a difference. It's coming together around your leadership. It's coming together in your teams. For us, it's our innovation model. It's important to have those moments in person as part of how we innovate, whether it's with our customers or with our teams inside the company or our partners outside the company. That's an important part of it. So getting that balance right and understanding how to effectively do that as we bring this flexible work model forward in the company and take advantage of it as well is something we're still learning and adjusting to.
I'll move on to other topics in a moment, but our innovation center, one of them in the Minneapolis Fed, is our research department. We've got a brilliant team of PhD economists. This research department has a long storied history. This was the group of employees amongst all of us who throughout the pandemic were saying, we want to come back, we want to come back, we want to come back, because we have to collaborate with our colleagues, we have to challenge each other, we have to learn from each other, and how much of that innovation is lost being remote. I think it's hard to exaggerate that. I think it's a really big deal.
Yeah, and it's something we have in common. Our R&D community, they wanted to come back. They take advantage of the facilities. They need facilities in their work. It's also around this innovation model. And back to more than half of our employees are in factories. They never left.
Yes.
As we think about the working model going forward, we're also looking at what do they need to be more successful in the plants, and we're making changes. A big focus on safety, focus on how we support them in their flexibility that we can at the plant level, so we've got a number of different dynamics, and I would say, there's a desire to bring those moments that matter into each of those.
And by the way, you just touched on something, which is, COVID is obviously still with us, and thankfully, with vaccines and treatments, it's becoming a lot less deadly. I mean, it's becoming more endemic, more flu-like, which is fingers crossed that we're staying on that course. I'm just curious, in your plants, are you seeing kind of an ongoing level of people being sick just because there's flu, now there's COVID, other stuff going around, or is that not so much of a factor anymore?
Well, the notable one was the absenteeism we saw at the beginning of last year
because of Omicron.
With Omicron. Since then, we haven't seen that kind of elevated impact. We've been able to navigate it, and I think it's, the the flu season and the RSV, there's been, I think we've seen people come and be impacted more by that now
Yes.
than they were during the pandemic. So we're seeing that as a dynamic as well. But it's been more manageable at the plant level. Part of that is some of the practices that we put in place during the pandemic probably still help, the way we operate the factories, and certainly the amount of remote work that we do. We don't have as many people coming together in person in our offices around the world. So I think we've got a little less exposure inside the company.
Right.
And I think that we're seeing that also have some effect.
Yeah, and I actually think that's one of the lasting benefits, which is, how often would people come to work when they felt a little bit sick? Mm-hmm. And now, because the remote work for many folks it can be effective. It's like, hey, I don't feel quite well. I'm going to stay home just out of caution. Everybody ends up being better off in that situation.
Yeah, I think there's big changes like that. People are being more careful and respectful around that. You also see mask wearing. Our leadership conference, we had some people that wore a mask during the leadership conference of their. So there's a change in dynamic there. People are thinking differently about how to adjust and keep the community and their families and their work colleagues safer.
Yeah. So let's shift gears and let's talk about the regional economy. 3M has a big footprint in the 9th Federal Reserve District. I think you have around 20,000 employees in Minnesota alone. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious if you have perspective on the regional economy and how do you think about, I know you manufacture locally to serve your local markets, but how do you think about, say, within the U.S., do you want to put more in this region? Do you want to put more in the Southwest? I'm just curious, what leads those decisions?
Yeah, we tend to look at it at a regional basis. Regional for us is bigger than state or even country sometimes. We look at USAC as a region for us. So, U.S., Canada, and even with Mexico as part of that. We think about how we manage our regional capability for our customers across that region. And I would say we've invested in the U.S. historically. I mean, we're a headquartered U.S. global company. We grew up in the U.S., got our start and built our foundation here. That regional capability we build out around the world, it's those operations, those production lines, those portfolios that are most important to each of those regions. In some cases, we have capabilities that are similar in each region. We can make N95 respirators in every region of the world. We can make certain parts of our portfolio that are needed by customers in every part of the world. Not everything requires that. And so a number of those portfolios have remained in the U.S. where they might have had their first production lines, and we serve customers around the world. So it's really that strategy on a global basis that translates back to regional and then supporting those regional customers in the U.S. The build out in the U.S. has really been around sometimes geographically what positions us best for the customers. Often it's where we have an opportunity to build capacity and have access to a strong workforce. And so you see us in communities where we can be successful in having that retention in the workforce. Mm-hmm. Factory roles like ours, it's important that we don't have a high turnover rate. We bring people in that are successful, get trained, and then important that we retain those. And in some cases, we have a reputation in the community where we have multi-generational success in those communities. It's an important part of that foundation. So it's probably more about that sustainability and that ability to attract labor, that ability to be well positioned to do that reliably over time that really makes a decision. Now, the economic kind of view of the regions, we look at it by market, by customer, mm-hmm. more than we look at it by statutory state kind of roles. But it's important that in some cases we are close to those customers, and we'll position distribution centers and also some production to be closer to those customers. A lot of our products, we have the ability to move them. We have a lot of roll-to-roll processing, jumbos that we make, big rolls that we can ship around to be converted into smaller formats and customer-specific formats around the world, so that we have a lot of flexibility where we put those. Other times it's a finished goods that is important that we're closer to, like our consumer business, where our Filtrete brand home filtration products, we want to be close to those retail customers that we serve with that production, because we're shipping large format room air purifier, HVAC filtering solutions.
I'm curious, this is a micro comment which may not get raised all the way to you, but it's something I hear from businesses around the region, which is they've said to me, we would like to have more operations in this region, but the housing, affordable housing is such a barrier to us being able to attract the workers we need. Even if we can attract the workers, they cannot find a place to live that they can afford that meets their family's needs. I'm just curious, does this come up, or is that something that's would be more at the regional level for your regional operators?
Well, I think it's part of the decision. Back to, do we have access to the labor?
Yes.
And have access to labor that we have continuity and sustainability around it, that people will stay with 3M.
Yeah.
And if they can't afford to live in the area, you aren't going to be able to do that. So I think that's inherently part of where we decide ultimately to put our factories. Our sources of supply, they have customer focus. They have certainly a financial focus on it. Where can we do it the most efficiently? And it's really about attracting labor and being able to do that reliably over time. So that ability to afford housing is a factor in that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're involved with, and you're an alumnus of the University of Minnesota. I've always said to folks that the richness of our university system here is actually a key economic advantage. It's a source of talent. I'm just curious for 3M, how does that fit into your planning for the future of the company?
Well, focus on, I would say, university relationships in general is really important. We recruit a lot of STEM talent into the company. STEM is a passion of the company. It shows up in our community engagement and priorities. It's part of our sustainability priorities and our strategies to really, we talk about science for circular, science for climate, science for community, and STEM education focus. University relationships are really important. None more important than the University of Minnesota. We have our largest R&D, I would say largest number of R&D personnel here based in Minnesota at our headquarters. We still do a significant portion of our research and development here. A lot of those are University of Minnesota alumni, and we do have a very strong partnership. I have a lot of engagement with the university. I'm on the board of trustees at the University of Minnesota. It's a long-term relationship. We have been partners with the university in many of the departments at a university level, and continue to see it as an important place to recruit talent for the future. We look, as a global company, we look broader than that. We look outside the U.S. We look at and certainly recruit and engage more broadly across the U.S. and Illinois as well. So more broadly across the Big Ten. But it's certainly an important strategy. Attracting top talent. The model that we have, growing our business based on our innovation, being able to deliver unique, differentiated value from our technology, from our manufacturing capabilities. It's all comes back to people. Nothing we do it would exist without people. So attracting top talent, being focused on recruiting in universities, bringing 3M to the universities to engage and I think inspire people to consider a career in 3M. It's something too that I'm sure we'll talk more about. But as you think about goals to become more diverse and inclusive, so for us, we made a commitment coming out of the tragedy with George Floyd that we were going to step up in new ways in the community here in the Twin Cities, but also in how we move forward with underrepresented groups in the company, and that shifts how you recruit too. So we're adjusting and moving out and expanding, I would say, really our efforts in recruiting, really where the talent is that we're looking to add, and that's another dimension of it. That's an important aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, related to this discussion, it reminded me that a lot of businesses have said to me, and they've said publicly, and I've said publicly, how important immigration is to feed our nation's economy. It's a huge source of talent, either very highly educated talent, but also workers across the education spectrum that we need for the economy. But the interesting thing is some businesses have said, hey, if our political system cannot meet our needs, with the adoption of technology, we can now access those workers remotely. We would rather have them here, but if we cannot have them here, then we will tap into them wherever their home country is. Do you see that at 3M? Is that a factor as you think about talent?
Well, technology certainly gives you more flexibility in your models and how you do things. I mean, we have a follow the sun capability in our customer service, for example, because of the remote capabilities. We're able to bring teams together in parts of the world so that we can manage it, 24/7. So those are examples. We have certainly brought in more remote workers as part of our more flexible work. Not quite as flexible as around the world. I would say a lot of we do have 3Mers based in every part of the world that have responsibility for global operations or global businesses or global functions. So we do manage it that way. But if you look more broadly across our workforce, even the remote workers that serve operations in the U.S., they're typically in the U.S. market. So it's probably not as extensive in that dimension. That not to say we won't add that as we go forward. I think that's certainly an option. We are leveraging our flexibility to attract the top talent and bring in top talent that might not have considered a relocation to Minnesota or to another one of our operations around the world, but are willing to join 3M as long as they can be remote. So we are taking advantage of that and certainly have added people more than we've had in the past that are remote.
If you look at the demographics of most advanced economies, their societies are aging. They're having fewer children than prior generations, and this economic growth comes from two things: productivity growth, so great innovation, and population growth. And so this is why economies around the world, advanced economies, are struggling. And so, as I've analyzed it, I've been quite outspoken about it. If you look at America's history, one of the big sources of our economic strength has been our ability to attract immigrants. And so the challenge is going to be, can we reach some kind of an agreement on how to make sure that that is a tool for us? Because many countries don't have that option. It's at least an option for us. And so, fingers crossed. I'm biased. My parents are immigrants from India, and my wife is an immigrant from the Philippines. But I think the economics are quite clear on this.
Yeah, and as a global company, we are supportive of immigration policy, and it is, we recognize it's been a great strength of the U.S. economy, and so I agree. It's something we got to continue to support and promote.
And on diversity, I know you already talked about the work that 3M is doing. It's a big priority for us here at the Minneapolis Fed. Has been for a long time. George Floyd's murder certainly intensified our focus on these efforts. Are you seeing us as a society making progress?
Well, I think yes. I mean, I look at what's happened. Even go back to George Floyd. What's happened, the actions that have been taken. A lot of positive, constructive actions, and it's across society. Yeah. It's not limited to institutions or government or individual communities. I really have been impressed about the commitment and the follow through. We talked about it at the time. We looked at the killing of George Floyd, excuse me, as a call to action for us as a company. So it hit our employees hard, and especially in the Twin Cities, but globally, I would say it hit 3Mers hard. And so we saw it as something we had to bring the strengths of companies to the table. When we decide something's a priority, we allocate resources to it, we set goals, we hold ourselves accountable to it, we have plans, we follow through. And we made a commitment that these are going to be actions that we follow through. They became strategic priorities for us. And so we've been doing a good job on following through. We've created new partnerships. Interesting, we've seen this with other companies, we've seen this with other institutions, we've seen this in communities. We wanted it to be different this time, that we would have follow through. So not only do I see positive progress, I see legs to the commitments that companies and institutions and communities have made. And I think that's positive. I mean, I have a lot of faith that people are going to, continue to follow through and drive improvements. And I think the progress we've had to this point is encouraging, and I think it shows that we're gonna stay the course and find new ways to step up as we go.
Yeah, I'll say our organization is tiny compared to 3M, but here at the Minneapolis Fed, we have a lot of employee resource groups, and they've in many cases taken the lead, which is they've said, hey, this is what's important to us, this is what we're seeing, this is where we need support, and then the leadership has said, hey, we support you. These are good ideas. Let's put these into action. And I'm seeing evidence that it's bearing fruit, but obviously we still have work to do.
Yeah, at our employee resource networks, as we call them, they've been the leaders in this and following through on action. It's also been a virtuous kind of time for us, a cycle for us. Our ERN's grown by 25% in the last couple of years, and I think it's partly desire to come in and be part of a community and make a difference. It's also seeing that we are going to take action. We're going to build on it. So it's an opportunity to make a difference. And so I'm very encouraged by that. We look to them. We have engagement. We have a inclusion council where we come together and really focused on those priorities, making a difference and moving not only 3M ahead in our own diversity goals, but also, as I said, being a partner in the communities.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, Mike. We've covered a lot today. Are there any other thoughts you wanted to offer on 3M, on the regional economy, on the global economy? I mean, I think we could keep talking for a long time, but we do have to wrap up here in a minute or two.
Yeah, I think it's, like I said, 2022, we took some actions that built a foundation and positioned us for 2023 in the future. We also managed through some challenges in the year, and those don't stop December 31st going to January 1. So I think we still expect to see some ongoing challenges in supply chains around the world. We expect to be managing some dynamics that we saw. I was at an investor conference in early December. We talked about some of the dynamics we were seeing in our end markets as we came through the second half of the year. We're seeing slowing in consumer categories, seeing a shift in consumer spending from hard lines. So-called hard lines might include things like consumer electronics, include some of our products in 3M, some of our home improvement products, things like that, into areas like food, more of a shift. And also consumer spending probably going back to a more historical balance between, products and goods and services. And so we were seeing that dynamic slow down there, and it impacted our consumer electronics business. It impacted certainly our retail business. It also impacted things like our oral care business, where you have more consumer discretion. And so we saw some of those dynamics. As you look at the new year, the outlook is still for positive economic growth. We see areas like automotive and transportation with an outlook for positive growth. We see our industrial markets with an outlook for positive growth. I think that those are all things that we look at managing some of the challenges that we face. We also look at taking advantage of the opportunities, and some of those markets are areas that we're investing in and following through on even the commitments we made last year to invest in innovation in areas that we see the outlook for growth, but also where we can make a difference and have a differentiated value. So we see both sides of it as we come into the new year. We probably have a wider view on scenarios as we come into the new year, just looking, we could see further improvements, we could see further economic challenges, and I think companies in general are, taking I think a wider view of the outlook for the new year, but like I said, we're well positioned, and we're going to continue to invest in areas like where we can grow, and we'll continue to stay focused. Our teams have done a great job of managing through the disruptions over the last year and are well and ready for what comes in the new year as well.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of all my colleagues for joining us today. I also want to thank you again for being such a helpful partner for us, source of information. I've called you time and time again. You've put me in touch with your supply chain experts. You put me in touch with some of your technologists. You're a great resource for us, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Well, I value every engagement, Neel. So thanks for the conversation today, and thanks for the ongoing dialogue.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Neel and Mike. That's a hard act to follow. And thank you everyone for tuning in to our webinar today on regional economic conditions. My name is Joe Mann. I'm a regional outreach director for the Minneapolis Fed. Shortly, I'll be turning it over to our expert panels on regional economic conditions in our 9th district states. But first, I'm going to kick things off by presenting some results from our annual survey of manufacturing. So this is a good sort of follow up to the conversation we just had, because the Minneapolis Fed, in conjunction with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, does an annual survey of manufacturers in our region. So I'm just going to briefly run over some of the results of that survey that we're releasing this morning. I should start with the standard reminder that my opinions are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So what I'll be going over today is just a kind of a brief highlight of the manufacturing sector, its size and its role that it plays in our regional economy in the 9th Federal Reserve District before I get into the results from this year's survey that we just conducted at the end of 2022. Headline results from the survey, in spite of the challenges that the economy faced in 2022, the manufacturers that we surveyed in our region told us that they overall experienced growth in 2022. And again, despite some uncertainty about the outlook for 2023, fairly stable outlook for the year ahead in 2023. So I'm glad to hear Mike Roman say just now that his outlook for 3M is for continued growth in 2023, because that's also what we heard from the manufacturers in our survey. We also asked a special question about what's been going on with supply chains this year, just to follow up on a question we asked on that last year. We asked whether conditions are getting better or worse, and unfortunately, the manufacturers that we surveyed told us that generally those challenges have remained an issue, remained prominent for them in the last year. So I'll start with a little bit of an overview of the manufacturing sector, just to kind of level set the importance of this sector in the United States, and especially in the 9th Federal Reserve District. So if you look at the composition of GDP, what we produce as a country, manufacturing represents about 11% of our output in the US, but a slightly larger share in our 9th District states. Likewise, in terms of employment, where people are working, once again, the 9th District has a relatively larger share of our workers working in factories or otherwise in manufacturing than the US as a whole. About 12% of workers in our 9th District states are employed in some capacity in manufacturing versus 8% in the US. So a very large and important sector of our economy, and one of the ones that's most tangible for all of us. We can, we might have a harder time envisioning financial services, but we can really picture what happens in the manufacturing sector, and it's a pretty important bellwether for the economy overall. So because of its importance in our region, we, for a couple decades running, have been conducting a survey in conjunction with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. I'll talk a little bit about the background on that survey. This is an annual survey that we do. It follows the best practices of a random scientific survey. So we conduct a random sample of manufacturers that we poll via US mail. I send them a form in the mail, and that sample is stratified by state and firm size, so that we're getting a representative group from each state relative to their size in the composition of manufacturers overall. And this year we had just under 400 respondents get back to us. And as I mentioned, I have to give a lot of thanks to our partners at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. They conduct the survey for the state of Minnesota, and we at the Minneapolis Fed conduct the survey for the other states in our region. And just as a reminder, those are North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and then portions of Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And for those interested in seeing the results just for Minnesota, DEED is also releasing these results on their website this morning. I'll just be previewing our results for the district as a whole in brief. And again, those of you who are interested in more detail on the survey, you can find more on the article on our website at minneapolisfed.org. So the overall headline result from this year's survey is that we saw growth in activity in 2022. Again, despite some of the hiccups that we've experienced in the continuing supply chain challenges, the rise of inflation in 2022, manufacturers overall told us that they saw growth in their firms this year. So those results are represented here as what we call a diffusion index. So it's just a quick way of aggregating the responses from the manufacturers that we surveyed into an index that tells us whether an indicator increased or decreased. So values higher than 50 in the index indicate on average expansion in that indicator, and values below 50 indicate contraction. And so as you can see across an array of indicators here, our respondents told us that they saw growth. The strongest growth among the strongest categories was new orders. In fact, more than half of manufacturers told us that they saw an increase in new orders in 2022 relative to a year earlier. We also saw growth in production and in productivity as well. Not surprisingly, given the higher rate of inflation that we're all experiencing, a very strong majority, more than 80% of manufacturers told us that they increase the prices that they charge for the products that they produce. Employment at manufacturers increased on average, maybe less than you might expect given the overall strength in the sector. I'll say a quick word about employment. I think the relatively more subdued growth in employment this year, just going by the comments that we received from survey respondents, was largely due to very tight supply of labor. So we got a lot of comments about tight supply of labor. And if you look at the results of our website, we also ask our manufacturers about what happened with compensation this year. Very strong growth in wages. That's one of the kind of headline results from the survey that we published. We had nearly half of respondents, about 45%, told us that they increased wages per worker at their company by 6% or more in 2022. So we asked these manufacturers about performance at their company over the past year, and then we also asked them to look ahead to the coming year. But before I get into those results, just to kind of, I think it's helpful to kind of look at how these survey results have tended to come in over time. And as you can see, comparing 2022 to the year before, we saw a sort of sideways movement. Again, we're in growth territory for orders for production and for employment in these categories. And so relatively typical year, at least in terms of the aggregate results. But now we're 2 years removed from the pandemic, from 2020. We're now 2 full years removed, and that's well in the rearview mirror for a lot of the manufacturers that we've surveyed. So that's kind of the backward-looking portion of our survey. As I mentioned, we also asked the manufacturers about what they expect to happen at their firms for the coming year. And overall, while you see that some of these, that most of these indicators are, again, in growth territory. So the gold bars compares their 2023 outlooks for their companies to what they told us, what I already showed you for the performance that they experienced in 2022. And you can see that most of these indicators are consistent with what we saw last year, at least as far as being in growth territory. So in direction, on average, they're up. But if you break into the results, you can find these in the table on our website, the largest share of respondents for most of these categories told us that they expect no change in 2023. So while they saw growth in 2021 and 2022, some of them are telling us that they expect more growth in 2023. Some of them, of course, are telling us that they expect decreases in 2023. But the largest share of them in most of these categories are telling us that they just expect sort of steady as she goes in 2023. And importantly, I want to point out that these are their expectations for their companies, not necessarily for the economy overall, which I'll get into in a moment. As with 2022, the 2 indicators that were in contraction territory were profits and exports, and those are both on balance expected to come in negative to level in the year ahead. One sort of bright note from the results here is the outlook for prices given inflation. Is still in expansion territory, but at a much less acute level than we saw in 2022. So while the manufacturers we surveyed are telling us they still expect to increase their prices on average in the coming year, we had a larger share of them telling us that they're not expecting to change their prices in the coming year, which is consistent with what we've seen on recent readings of inflation. So to kind of put this in context, again, by sort of historical standards, where does our sort of optimism index fall this year relative to previous years? You can see that again, for these 3 key indicators for new orders, for production and employment, they're all in positive territory for this year, but the index has dipped a little bit relative to last year, and it's in fairly typical territory for what we see in a normal year. Again, those are just expectations for manufacturers' own firms in the year ahead. We also asked them about their overall economic expectations, and those are a bit more pessimistic, maybe not surprisingly, given all the uncertainty in the economic outlook right now. But businesses, on average, expect in the coming year their state economies to fall into contraction territory for a few of these key macroeconomic indicators you see here for business investment, for employment. And I want to point out, I'm comparing here their outlook from a year ago. So not the most recent survey results, but their outlooks in 2022 for 2021 for 2022 were generally optimistic for the coming year. And this year, while they had a really high inflation outlook last year, still in elevated inflation outlook for the coming year, but all of these other indicators, business investment, employment, consumer spending, and corporate profits are in contraction territory in terms of their expectations for their overall state economies in the coming year. So while they're optimistic for their own firms and for manufacturing in general, expectations for the coming year are a little bit more subdued at the state level. Last thing I want to cover before I turn it over to my colleagues is just the special question we asked about supply chains. We know this has been an ongoing issue, really for all of our sectors of the economy, but particularly for manufacturers. They've been experiencing these supply chain disruptions for several years running now. And we asked a question on last year's survey about whether they were experiencing problems due to a variety of reasons. And this year we decided to revisit that question and basically ask them whether the challenges they were experiencing got better or worse. And what you can see from these results here, if you look at the breakdown of responses, sort of issue by issue, generally speaking, most manufacturers told us that these challenges either got worse or were unchanged. Big exception is COVID-19. Perhaps unsurprisingly, just about 40% of manufacturers told us that the supply chain issues due to COVID-19 got better. The most severe challenges are going to be the labor issues at suppliers. Overwhelming share telling us that those got worse over the coming year, and then also transportation and logistics issues as well. Turning into raw materials availability, while there was a larger share, just about a quarter of respondents told us that raw materials availability got better in the last year. About half of them told us that it got worse over the past year. So a fairly mixed bag there. Again, overall, results of the survey, while they're positive for the past year and the outlook is stable for the year ahead, manufacturers are telling us they're still dealing with a variety of supply chain challenges, at least through the past year. Again, you can find more of detail on these results on our website, minneapolisfed.org, or on the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development's website. But that's all I wanted to share this morning. And I think a good way of teeing up our conversations that we're going to have in the next two panels. And with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Ron Wirtz, who is going to be moderating our first expert panel.
Thanks, Joe. Great job. Very interesting stuff. And good morning, everyone. My name is Ron Wirtz. I'm Regional Outreach Director for the Minneapolis Fed. Joe's done a really nice job of helping us transition to that second half of the program that he mentioned. That's really about the ninth district economy. So we've learned a little bit about manufacturing. The next hour is going to provide an overview of state economies in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota from an expert in each of those states. Then the following session after that, we'll discuss labor markets and workforce development in Minnesota, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and Wisconsin. And we'll have experts from the three of those states as well. The format's going to stay similar for both sessions, and I'll describe them real quick. Each speaker is going to be introduced before their presentation and given up to 15 minutes to present formal remarks. And then after all three speakers in the session have presented, there'll be roughly 10 to 15 minutes left for moderated Q&A. So if you have questions, we'll be checking the Q&A box. So put your questions in there as soon as you have them. With that, we'll start our first session on state economies. And our first speaker is Amy Watson from Montana. Amy is Montana's state economist with the Department of Labor and Industry, where she conducts analysis of economic and demographic conditions to help inform state policy. Among many research interests, Amy has actually partnered with the Minneapolis Fed on research measuring the extent and impact of childcare shortages. So please welcome Amy Watson as our first presenter. Amy, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Ron. As Ron mentioned, my name is Amy Watson. I am the state economist with the Montana Department of Labor and Industry, and I'm excited to be here today to talk to you all a little bit about what's going on in Montana. So in Montana right now, we've had a fairly rapid recovery from the pandemic recession. So the pandemic recession was sharp and a significant drop in all areas of our economy, but then we were able to recover that very quickly. Our And jobs recovered by May of 2021, and our GDP recovered by the third quarter of 2020. In 2021, we experienced significant growth. It was a record-breaking year for Montana in a lot of ways in terms of employment growth and GDP growth, as well as wage growth. And then in 2022, we've seen growth moderate significantly, so to more of our long-run trend. Headwinds in Montana that I'll speak about a little bit are similar, I'm sure, to things that are happening in other states. We're experiencing significantly tight labor markets, and inflation is also eating into some of our economic growth as well. Our real GDP growth, I think, is what you're seeing here. So we're looking at significant GDP growth in 2021 of about 4.8%. It was just slightly below what the US was experiencing. And then we did have like a slight blip in 2020 of just negative 0.3% overall. Of course, that was a significant drop in the second and third quarter, and then we recovered quickly by the end of the third quarter. And then looking forward, we are growing at about 1.5%, which is consistent with our long run average. Rapid employment growth, both in 2021 and 2022. We've seen about 3.8 and 3.2% growth in those 2 years. On average, over those 2 years, we've added about 18,300 jobs per year. And that's 2.8% faster than typical. So just really rapid employment growth over that time frame. And almost every industry has recovered jobs. I believe the only one that hasn't is transportation. We are experiencing significant population growth as well as labor force and employment growth. This shows that we've had about 20,000 additional individuals entering our labor market, our labor force, since the beginning of the pandemic over the last 3 years. We've seen about 25,000 people come in terms of employment, and our population has also been growing. So part of the reason, and our unemployment has been dropping, and part of that reason is because our labor force is not growing quite as rapidly as our employment growth. And so that, of course, is causing that tightening, and we're seeing significant labor market shortages. Our unemployment hit a record low in 2022 of about 2.4%. Apologize. There we go. Okay. Our unemployment rate hit about 2.4% in the middle of 2022. And has come up slightly since then. We're sitting at about 2.9%, still well below the state or the national unemployment rate. And significantly over the last year or so, we've seen a drop in the number of long-term unemployed of about 56% drop. So it's hit a new record low. We've never seen this few number of people who are long-term unemployed, meaning they've been out of the labor market for or unemployed for 16 weeks or more. And so then that really indicates to us significant tightening. And again, this tightening has been going on for the better part of the last decade, but the COVID pandemic certainly exacerbated those issues. Right now, we estimate that we have about 2 job openings per every unemployed person. You can see kind of how that has changed over time. At the peak of the 2009 recession, we had about 3 people per job opening. And then pre-pandemic, again, we were in that tight labor market territory. We experienced about 1.4 job openings per every unemployed person. But then since then, during the pandemic, it's really gotten more significant. We were at about 3 job openings per person in the middle of 2022, and it's come down slightly, mostly due to a decrease in the number of job openings that we estimate, not necessarily a change in our unemployed, but it still sits very high at about 2.7 jobs per person. And part of the reason that our labor market has gotten tighter over the last few years, or continues to tighten, is our labor force participation rate is dropping. About 62.1 or 62.4% in Montana is our current labor force participation rate. It is trending with the national average, and a lot of that has to do with our retiring population. Montana is an older population in general, and so we've seen a significant rise in the number of retirements over the last few years. Retirees make up about 60% of the population of people who are out of our labor force. A little over, we hit that 200,000 mark in terms of retirees, and that number is projected to continue to increase as more of those baby boomers exit our labor market. The next largest is illness and disabilities. All of those other factors have really been holding relatively steady over the last 20 years or so. And so really what's driving the decrease in our labor force participation rates is that those demographic shifts. But one thing that we've been interested in looking at specifically over the last 3 years or so is the number of people who are out of the labor force because they're caring for family. We've seen a significant change in that population, largely due to a lack of available and affordable childcare. This is another one of the potential headwinds to future economic growth. We estimate that in Montana, licensed childcare capacity meets only about 43% of our estimated demand. That's statewide. This is a map of Montana's 56 counties, and you can see that there are a number of counties that are that light color that indicates a childcare desert where demand meets less than a third, or supply meets less than a third of demand. And that is, we estimate demand as the number of children who are living in working parent households, meaning either they're dual parent households where both parents are in the labor force, or single parent households where that individual is working. And so that has created significant underutilization of our parental labor force. We see the about 20,000 Montana parents who are not in the labor force due to family responsibilities, another 20,000 or so who are absent or working part-time because of those family responsibilities, and then about 29,000 who are working reduced hours. So in total, we see nearly 70,000 Montana parents who we consider to be underutilized source of labor in our economy. And you can see how that changed over the last 3 years. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing about 62,000, and then it peaked, added about 10,000 to that number, about 71,000, and then has come down slightly, but still remains elevated compared to prior to the pandemic. And again, like our tight labor markets, the childcare shortage existed before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic exacerbated that issue as well and really brought it to the forefront of economic development efforts in Montana. Montana has seen real wage and income growth over the last 5 years or so. We've seen our wages grow dramatically in terms of real wages. In 2020, it was a significant year for wage growth, about 8.6% growth over that year. But then in the last couple of years, inflation has eaten into our wage gains. And so we've seen negative real wage growth in 2021 and 2022. It's a similar story when you look at our income levels. Per capita income in Montana has continued to grow, but as you can see in there, we're currently sitting at about $57,000 for per capita income, which is just slightly above our inflation level currently. So we have seen wage gains, but those wage gains have been eaten into in the last couple of years. And so that is something that will continue to be an issue in terms of economic growth in the future. And part of that inflation picture has really been what's happening to shelter costs and specifically our housing market. And so in Montana, we've seen about a 54% increase in our median home price since 2015 in Montana. I've highlighted a few of our major counties in the state. Gallatin County is where Bozeman is located. It's in the southwest portion of Montana, very close to Yellowstone, and a lot of outdoor recreation in that area. Their median home price is approaching $800,000 in Montana, or in Gallatin County. And we've also seen the Flathead is up by Glacier. That's about 650,000, Missoula, of course, and then Lewis and Clark County, where I'm located in the capital of Helena. Yellowstone County is Billings, Cascade County is Great Falls, and Silver County is Butte. So you can see there's a significant variation in our home prices over the state, across the state, but all of these areas have seen home prices more than double over the last 3 years or so. And then it's increased by 54% across the entire state. And a lot of that, and I'll wrap up with this, has to do with our in-migration. Montana's been always been an in-migration state, or has been for the last couple of decades at least. We tend to average about 6,200 net immigrants moving into Montana. Most of that is domestic migration. In the last 2 years, we've seen net immigration more than double. So we've seen over the 2-year time frame about 41,000 people, which represents about 3.8% of our population. So Montana is a large state with not, we have about 1.1 million people that live in the state in total. So that is a significant number of people that we've seen really come into Montana. And in fact, we are ranked second in the nation for the largest percent of in-migration over that time period. And some of you may guess the number one is Idaho, as Boise's been kind of the poster child for that. But certainly in Montana, we're feeling similar effects, and it has impacted our housing market as well as other aspects of the economy. But again, when we think about labor market tightness, those immigrants are welcome into Montana to help our labor shortage as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ron. Our website there, I posted, there's the link to it. It's lmi.mt.gov. And yeah, I look forward to taking your questions at the end here.
Thank you very much, Amy. A wonderful kickoff to this session. Lots of good information. Already have a couple of questions for you based on what I heard there. If anyone else has questions, remember, please put them in the chat box so we can try to get to those. So let's go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is David Flynn from North Dakota. David is Research Director at the Institute of Policy and Business Analytics at the Nistler College of Business and Public Administration at the University of North Dakota. David does a lot of things, including analysis and forecasts on employment, tax, and other variables in the regional and state economy. Please welcome David Flynn.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. I always enjoy this, and I've enjoyed hearing the discussion both of Montana, but also the discussion from the Fed President and 3M CEO. So without any further ado, I will sort of just move us along here and just laying a little bit of groundwork. I think you look at what happened in the 2010 to 2020 time period pre-COVID, and you can say that this might have been the decade for North Dakota. You saw something on the order of 13% in terms of population growth overall. It was a radical departure from what had been a slowly declining population. You also saw a significant rise in monthly tax receipts. We saw a transition as lots of different economic fundamentals within the state changed, but significant increases in the various different tax revenues and tax streams that we had going on as a result. And so these were really important and really major changes. So in terms of what I would sort of say as the framework to the recent change, I think we'll start seeing some important work saying North Dakota had maybe the best run of any state from 2010 to 2019. But what does that mean for the post-COVID era? In addition to things like population and taxes, we saw a 66% growth in the nominal gross state product from that 2010 to 2019 time period. And so that's a significant rise. And obviously, the industry that gets most of the attention and probably most of the credit for this is the oil industry. Energy in general, important to the state for certain. But when you look and see that there is something on the order of a 525% increase in monthly oil production measured in barrels of oil produced, it's hard to look beyond that and say others were as responsible or more responsible. And so I think the question that comes into play here and now is something on the order of can or will this continue? Are the economic conditions there to permit this to go on? And I would suggest that the answer seems to be yes, but as always, there are some questions that we would have. So like much of the country, North Dakota finds itself in a post-COVID crossroads. Some very similar challenges to what the state has dealt with for the last 20, 30, maybe even 50 years. And while they're similar, there are distinctions that might make it important to look for new solutions, especially when you compare it to the circumstances like we already heard from Montana, like what I'm sure we'll hear for South Dakota and the region in general, but also with a varied national backdrop that we see now. Labor supply issues have been a constant in North Dakota for the last 20 or so years. It's actually the U.S. that has sort of come to the level of problem North Dakota has had for some time, which in the realm of misery loves company might be a good thing, but in the realm of being competitive, North Dakota businesses looking for workers, looking for labor, that's not a good scenario because you then are competing in a very different labor market than you were before. We've also heard about inflation issues here as well, and much like the great data from Montana showed, wage gains have shown significant depreciation in terms of real value, but you've also seen incredible appreciations in home costs and other things, other assets of that type over this time as well. And then, of course, the question I think that's getting insufficient attention from businesses going forward right now is the interest rate question, and I'll highlight that in a little bit. North Dakota, though, I think has a good foundation for growth. The question becomes, what's that next growth driver going to be? First challenge I'd highlight is that labor force is just not expanding. This is the North Dakota labor force. And you can see that since about 2015, it has essentially plateaued, some slight decline in the post-COVID era with a little bit of recovery. But North Dakota enjoying an enormous run-up as oil expanded the draw, particularly for 20 to 30-year-old males. And that extended oil industry growth was really important in keeping many of them here as they started to mature in their life cycle, looking at family formation, staying here and pivoting out of oil into other industries or maintaining work in that oil industry was really important for that labor force expansion. But it hasn't been expanding really since that first pivot in the oil price market. As we heard, labor force participation is going down. However, you can see that labor force participation in North Dakota is still much higher than the national average, unlike what we saw with Montana. That labor force participation rate is below 70%. But that decline, I think it's important to note, predates COVID. Too much, I think, attention is paid in some cases with some metrics to that COVID benchmark and suggesting that COVID was the driver. This has clearly been going on for quite some time. There are certainly age demographic considerations here as the graying of the population, the staying in the state. Those kinds of factors have certainly played a significant role. The exit of significant numbers of the college graduates to find job opportunities elsewhere and then come back later, if at all, has been a particular problem that the state's been confronting. But again, labor force participation is clearly something that we want to watch and see in terms of where it's going. And so again, the population increase, just like was said for Montana, it certainly explains some of the math behind that labor force participation decline. But again, the underlying demographics are not necessarily helpful in that regard. When you start talking about the 20 to 30-year-old increase, the exit of significant numbers when the oil industry jobs were drying up for a time, and then getting them back in. The in-migration is highly variable and highly volatile for North Dakota, very much keyed in when you look at the performance of the oil sector. You also look at things like birth rates above the national average, and so the continued growth elements are there. It's just a matter of the maintaining of that growth throughout the various years of the life cycle. In terms of one other factor, this North Dakota's legislature meets once every 2 years. This happens to be the year they're meeting, so they're in session right now. And obviously the big concern there is typically putting together the budget going forward. This is just a look at the overall monthly tax collections coming in. This data is from the North Dakota Office for the Management of the Budget. And you can see a lot of volatility in this number. Now, a significant increase as we've gone into oil. The surprise element there is not really much of a surprise. The introduction of oil introduced significant volatility into the overarching, the overall monthly receipts from the Office of Management of the Budget. And what you're seeing is that since we saw that oil industry start to become more established, start to lose that initial startup phase as an industry in the state, there's still growth in those revenues, but it is at a much more moderate pace as we've been going on, and that's what the trend line, the blue trend line there is trying to demonstrate. So we're seeing significant volatility that needs to be balanced and at some level understood against a nice, slow, steady growth pace. As we're looking at these taxes, we see that we've got opportunities. You see a significant number of these different taxes there. These are the most consistent performers in the state, and so there's significant additions that can be made with these, and significant pivots that can be made with these. But there's lots of different tax streams for the state to consider and the state to look at. And in particular, right now, one of the things I would highlight is that the state could be looking for fiscal flexibility. The state has the fiscal resources to entertain policy overhauls, whether they want to consider a change to the individual income tax, whether they want to ban the corporate income tax. Whatever they want to entertain from the perspective of growth, investment, and competitiveness, there is that opportunity just with current fiscal resources and the direction they seem to be going. Now, the other thing that's there is that there's currently a legacy fund in North Dakota. A portion of the dollars attained from oil industry taxes goes into the legacy fund. This was an initiative that was approved by the voters in the state, and it provides a certain percentage of revenues to every biennium. With currently $8 billion in that, there's obviously an opportunity to think more broadly with that fund and say, is it something to be leveraged beyond just a rainy day fund? If there are capital projects, investment avenues, the like, that need to be engaged in, can we look at the legacy fund as a possible source for this, instead of looking at it as a hole in the ground in which to bury funds? So I mentioned oil. Oil and the extractive industries are still the growth driver. However, the situation is changing. Again, it's a maturing sector. It's not an unimportant sector, but it's maturing. One of the things that we're hearing a lot of right now are co-production activities with the existing extractive industries, looking to expand into other things along with that coal lignite industry, as well as the oil industry. But we also see community activities looking to adjust and change in that local industry as well when the local base is changing. Oil output, you can see since that COVID-induced drop has recovered somewhat, but is fairly steady, fairly stable, kind of a plateau situation, which is interesting given the North Dakota first purchase price experienced a strong increase in the post-COVID era. And so, even with that significant rise in prices, we only recovered to levels that we saw immediately prior to COVID. And as a result of that, the industry, again, more mature, profit taking, waiting to see if price increases are sustainable. These are, of course, things that were going on as well. And so maturing is not less important. It's obviously a bedrock for tax revenues, the legacy fund, and other activities. It's certainly going to continue to be an important part with these co-activities, but it requires some long-term planning and a long-term horizon. Some risks to the outlook for this state in particular. I think increasing interest rates are a risk. I know everybody probably suggests that increasing interest rates are a risk, and they are. But the fact of the matter is we have individuals who've not experienced higher interest rate regimes because we haven't really seen them of this sort for a long period of time. Just like it's been 40 years since people have encountered this type of inflation. This type of interest rate regime is not something that is in the experience set of many people. I have fiscal concerns in terms of things like the U.S. debt ceiling and a game of chicken in Congress, raising the risk of U.S. debt default. I don't think the U.S. is going to experience debt default, but again, the risk of it, the plausibility of it becomes a problem as well. And then what I will also sort of point there is a lack of concerted effort in terms of a defined direction with economic growth initiatives in the state. North Dakota is a low population state, currently sitting in the mid 700,000 population. What I see in those circumstances is a need for more direction. It's interesting because there are current initiatives underway to try to assess, evaluate, and then improve things like digital skill sets within the population to allow for innovation to be more readily accepted and to increase the workforce available in some of those industries. But again, there needs to be, I think, a little more of a concerted effort on the policy front to try and direct people into those kinds of initiatives to support those labor force issues and those labor force concerns. And that is it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So I'm always struck by the uniqueness of the North Dakota economy, especially in comparison to all of the other 9th district states. So David, I really appreciate your ability to bring that contrast to our audience today. Great job. And we will move on to our last presenter. Our last presenter is Joe Santos from South Dakota. Joe is the director of the Ness School of Management and Economics at South Dakota State University. Along with teaching economics, Joe does research on financial regulation, monetary policy, commodity futures markets, and other topics. Please welcome Joe Santos for our last presentation.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. I'm going to offer a very quick overview of the South Dakota economy and what I think are some of the interesting sort of challenges and opportunities. I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to do this within a sort of pedagogical framework of production, and then people, and then place, in about 5 minutes apiece. So here we go. To begin with production, I want to just offer you a sense of sort of the GDP landscape, if you will. And so if we look at just private industry components, and let's all look at green and fire, right? And we'll just go very quickly clockwise here. That's finance, insurance, and real estate, of course, and that's the largest segment of private industry in the state. And then very quickly, we go up to professional and business services, and education and health and social assistance, agriculture and mining, of course, and then construction, manufacturing, and utilities. And then we go down to wholesale and retail and a few others. But primarily, it's about finance, insurance, real estate, manufacturing, construction, healthcare, and agriculture, right? So I want to take a look at sort of the household level and how the household has fared in recent years, and also allow us this as a sort of an off-ramp to a bit of analysis as well. So here I have per capita personal income for South Dakota. And so if you pick a date, go up to a line, turn left, that would be the dollar amount per capita. So say $65,000 per capita. And I have here not just South Dakota, but I also have, of course, the United States. And so there are a couple of interesting features here, some of which are probably well-traveled territories. The spikes there, of course, that's the pandemic and strong fiscal policies in the form of transfer payments, affording households a sort of stronger balance sheet, if you will, during the pandemic. And then what you see is a sort of leveling off and a return, if you will, to normal. And I want to focus on the very end of that, those two lines where the blue and the red lines end. You'll notice the blue is above the red line. And so at the moment anyway, per capita personal income in South Dakota registers a value that is greater than the value of per capita income in the United States. So that's interesting as it is, but I think this offers us a really interesting analytical ramp, if you will, for what's going on in the labor markets in South Dakota. So allow me just a little bit of turgid analysis here. I want to think about what's going on in per capita personal income. And of course, that's income divided by the population. And so the really easy way to dismiss what's going on perhaps is this kind of depopulation story and saying, well, it's income divided by people and the state has fewer and fewer people. So that's why income divided by people is relatively high. And of course, that's not the case. And here we can see that. So population growth in South Dakota is greater than population growth in the United States more generally. So that sort of quick dismissive answer isn't going to work. So why else is per capita income above the United States level? And here, a little more analysis, if I may. So I have just a very simple decomposition. Per capita personal income is on the left. It's income divided by the population. And I think of this as sort of being driven by three potential sources, and we'll walk through them very quickly. Either per capita income is rising because income per person is rising. You can think of this as a productivity force, if you will, or the employment rate is rising. That's one minus the unemployment rate. So, if the unemployment rate is 3%, that ratio is 97%. So that could be a driving force behind rising per capita income, or it could be what I've heard my colleagues talk a lot about in the context of their region so far, the labor force participation rate. Right. So those are the driving forces. And it turns out in the case of South Dakota, the reason why per capita income is relatively high really comes down to those latter two forces. It's essentially a high employment rate and it's a high labor force participation rate that is essentially supporting per capita income in the state. So let me show you this. I'm going to just show you a quick picture of those employment rates, both for South Dakota and the region. And then quick picture of that labor force participation rate, again, South Dakota and the region. So here are the employment rates. So again, pick a date, go up, say to the blue line, turn left, maybe you see 95. Well, that would mean that you have a 5% unemployment rate, and so a 95% employment rate. And so for South Dakota, we have a very low unemployment rate. We continue to have a very low unemployment rate. And that's one of the reasons why per capita income is as high as it is. The other is really sort of an outlying feature, and that is for South Dakota, labor force participation rate remains not only above the United States labor force participation rate, that is the blue line's above the red line, but the blue line isn't experiencing the sort of downward pitch, if you will, that it is in so many other places in the country. So our labor force participation rate is high, and it is sort of persistently high. And so that's it. We have relatively strong per capita income in the state because in some sort of loose way, we're sort of working a lot, right, in terms of employment rates and labor force participation rates. And I'll just show you this numerically. So in other words, 66 is bigger than 65. I'm looking at the per capita income levels there. 66 is bigger than 65 because 98 is bigger than 96 and 69 is bigger than 62, right? So those are the driving forces behind what right now is a relatively high per capita income. Having said that, though, of course, this is all happening while the purchasing power of money is falling, right? We have an inflation problem, as we all know. And so no matter per capita income in real terms is not performing in the way any household would like. And so here, I just direct your attention to the very right of the screen, and you've got a blue line and a red line that seem to be converging, but in a way that we would rather them not converge. That is, both for the United States and for the state of South Dakota, real personal income, what that personal income buys, is essentially stagnated. And so the growth in real personal income is hovering around zero. And that's just very simple, right? income is rising in nominal terms, more money per household, but so too are prices rising. And so stuff per household is flat. Okay, now people. So here what I'm thinking about is a bit of a decomposition of the labor market in South Dakota and sort of where the bodies are in terms of employees. So I'm going to put a lot on this chart, but I first want to explain what will be on this chart. So I have one sector up here right now, the government sector. And what's going on here is I'm showing you not the number of people employed in the government sector, but rather the number of people employed relative to the number right before the pandemic. So if you pick a date, go up, turn left, and let's say you hit the number 1, the way to use 1 in a sentence is that for that date, there is precisely the same number of employees in the government sector as there were just prior to the pandemic, right? So that's the government sector. Now I'm going to make this picture a mess by bringing up a bunch of others, right? And so we see all different sorts of behaviors, and I'm going to clean this up very quickly. I think I see a sort of pattern here, so I'm going to share with you what I think the pattern is, and that is in 2 of these sectors, we notice in construction and professional and business services in the state, the number of employees in those industries has been rising, again, relative to the number just before the pandemic. But that's not the case in several other industries where we see this sort of flatlining. You saw it a moment ago with government, but you see it with other sectors now as well, finance and manufacturing and information technology and so forth. So it's an interesting sort of variation in the labor market where these markets are tight, but the number of employees going into one sector or the other is not homogeneous. There's variation there. And then the other bit of this in terms of people is basically their wage. And so here I have a very imperfect measure of wage, something we refer to as an average hourly earning. And again, here I'm just putting one up for you for a moment. This is leisure and hospitality, just so I can explain what we're looking at. So again, pick a date, go up to the green line, turn left, and I don't know, maybe you hit a number like 7. The way to use that in a sentence is to say that the wage rate in the leisure and hospitality industry rose year over year by 7%, right? So we've seen growth in the wage rate in leisure and hospitality. Okay, and this has been going on in other industries as well. So now I'm going to add a whole bunch of other lines, and it's going to be a complete mess, right? And so we've got this sort of Warshot test, right? What do we see? Well, I actually think I do see something, and that is toward the end of this mess on the right side, these lines are sort of diverging. And let me just emphasize this divergence. Some of them are sort of hovering around that 5 to 10% range, but some of them are not. And in particular, professional and business services, wages in that industry, and education and health services, wages in that industry seem to be slowing. So this is interesting from 2 perspectives, I think. One, it's just interesting that we see this sort of bifurcation and that stuff is happening in the labor market that is sort of reveals some variation, right? That's just an interesting story. But the other reason I think this is interesting is from the perspective of a macroeconomist. This to me suggests that perhaps the inflation problem is fading a little bit. And what I mean by this is this picture reveals that the purchasing power of money is falling, but that fall is not independent of what money is buying. If you buy education and healthcare services, you get more for your money than if you buy mining and construction services, where you get less for your money. That's a sort of microeconomic variation that is becoming apparent in figures like this that I reason could suggest that this sort of general problem of a depletion in the purchasing power of money may be fading. Okay, and finally, place. So in the last few minutes, here I'm thinking about land and real estate, because in South Dakota, this has been perhaps one of the greatest pain points. So I'm going to start just with a little academic reference. There's been quite a bit of work on this suggesting, and here most recently in the American Economic Journal, that when you have expansionary monetary policy, as we certainly did until recently, you tend to also see home price appreciation. It's a fairly reliable relationship. Interest rates are low. They're not now, but they were. Interest rates are low. House prices are high. And these folks do a little bit of work to demonstrate that according to their data set, and the data set includes a little bit of the 9th district, you see this sort of price appreciation in home values when the central bank lowers interest rates. And the white space doesn't mean that the phenomenon doesn't exist there. The white space just means the authors didn't have data for those areas. But the point is, there is this relationship. And I would argue that I think we're seeing that relationship play out in South Dakota as well, and in a way that is disproportionately greater than we're seeing the relationship play out in the nation. So let me show you what I mean. Here's a home price index, both for South Dakota and the United States. And here it screams homogeneity, right? We look just like the nation. According to this home price index, prices for homes have risen substantially, but they've done so in the United States. They've also done so in South Dakota. So sort of nothing interesting to see here except for the large spike, which incidentally, using these same data and going back to the housing bubble of 05, 07, however you want to date it, you do not see a spike this high according to these data. If we break this up though and sort of look at just the state of South Dakota, now we see something very interesting. If we just map out average list prices for homes, the darker the green, the more the jump in average list prices for homes over this year, right? A year ago today to now. And so you see South Dakota, and it's indeed a lot of the 9th district is in a darker green tone, suggesting that this home price appreciation is not homogeneous across the country. Otherwise, the picture would have the same color throughout the map, but rather there's quite a bit of variation, and the intensity of price appreciation resides to some extent in the 9th district. Okay, one more. So these are averages though. So someone is listening thinking, well, that's because there's some big home being built in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and it's bringing up the average. So I'm now just going to flip this and go to median, which of course is indifferent to outliers like that. And again, South Dakota is dark green. So very quickly, flip back and forth, a little bit of animation here. That's average, that's median. And in either case, South Dakota is in one of the darker green segments of the map, suggesting that this price appreciation is affecting us in ways that it's not necessarily affecting the rest of the country. And I can say if there's one sort of pain point or challenge, it's this one. This is what folks seem to be talking most about. And this also goes for agricultural land values. In the interest of time, I stuck with the residential housing stock, but this appreciation in general is something that folks are dealing with in the state. So I think my time is up, and so I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joe. What really strikes me is the diversity of all three of those presentations. Enjoyed them tremendously. I think you all three did a great job, not only bringing a lot of content, also staying on time, actually being a little bit ahead of time. So we have a lot of time for Q&A, which I'm thrilled about. Joe, I'm actually going to go back to you with the first question. And everybody's kind of addressed housing to some extent. And there's also a question online regarding housing. And I'm curious, it was also mentioned in the conversation with Neel and Mike regarding the effect of available housing and housing prices on economic development. And I'm wondering if the three of you, starting with Joe, could talk a little bit about housing supply and what prices are also having on what you see as probably long-term economic growth, kind of that push and pull. There's clearly demand. Doesn't seem like we're necessarily keeping up on housing stock. And I'm wondering if you each could talk a little bit about how you see that problem.
Yeah, thank you. So this is coming up an awful lot. Of course, it varies across the state, so there's heterogeneity within the state as well. Minnehaha County, Houma Sioux Falls, and so on is where issues of zoning and so forth are coming up a lot, is perhaps explaining some of the tightness in the supply. But nevertheless, to your larger point, there is a tight supply, and I think there is a correlation, if you will, between this tight supply of housing and the state's inability to really draw in additional labor. You saw in those employment rates and the labor force participation rates, they're very high. And the corollary of that, of course, is that there isn't a lot of accommodation there, right? So we really can't figure out a way, I think, to raise that labor force participation rate any higher or to raise that employment rate any higher. So that's a headwind as it is. And then to the point of your question, when you add to this that we don't have the housing stock necessary to house the employees, were we even to attract them, that's just an additional headwind happen. So I see this as a very big problem. Again, I know that the city of Sioux Falls, our greatest population center, sees this as a very great problem. And again, is thinking about issues around how we zone property and so forth, and dealing in our state, not just with the commercial and residential tension, but we're also with the agricultural tension, right? So there's sort of three things that you could do with that plot of land. And so that's one of the challenges we're working with, because there's no question, at least it seems to me, and I think everyone else who looks at it, that empirically the labor supply challenge and the housing challenge are deeply interrelated.
Right. Right. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. And just a quick note on Sioux Falls. I happen to follow a lot of the permitting activity there. They just released their annual permitting. It was almost $2 billion, which is almost double what a record year was in 2021. So yes, activity there is off the charts.
Mm-hmm.
If I can go to you, David, same question. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that topic, on the housing topic.
Yeah, we've seen price appreciation for houses here that are incredibly, high, 15, 20% annual price increases. I think the interesting circumstance that I see here is that it's spurring a significant amount of apartment activity. And I'm going to call it luxury apartment. I know luxury is kind of a subjective term, but it's a kind of a apartment living that on the first floor is commercial space, maybe a grocery store, maybe a restaurant, and above it are different kinds of apartments. The pricing of those is interesting, because I feel like because we're in a equilibrium right now that has high home prices because of construction, supply chain issues, because of labor availability issues within the construction sector, that high price allows them to build higher rent apartments. And so we're seeing in areas like Grand Forks and Fargo, more of those types of units being built. Now, I think that's potentially a short run solution in terms of getting people into the state, because there are nice units to rent. The problem is, and I think this is what Joe was alluding to, there's a long run concern when you're bringing somebody in. You don't want somebody necessarily coming in for a year or 2 years. And if there are not solutions now to a longer run issue like housing availability, it makes it that much harder to convince people to relocate. And so, yes, I can move in now and maybe I could build, but can you really, live in a nice apartment, build? But can you really do that when you look around and see that there's, just nothing but help wanted signs? Construction firms are, trying to go into the high schools to talk to people there and say, hey, if you're not going to college, you're not going to the military, maybe you should come work in a construction firm. And so it's an interesting, the only other thing I'll mention is that the interesting dynamic here I've seen is that in particular in a place like Grand Forks, the lower rent apartment units are not going out of service yet. They're not being pushed out, but that's to their long run detriment, because it's basically oversupplying a lower level of quality apartment unit, and as a result, that's leading to other issues there on that front for the apartment companies. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Thanks, David. So Amy, I think you provided kind of the most stark picture of this housing issue with regards to the median price increases that have just been wildly inflated over the last decade. Clearly, this is an issue in Montana. I'm curious how you see this as an economic development issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo the same comments that Joe and David were talking about in terms of just affordability and its impact on economic development. I think that's a significant concern in Montana, particularly in some of our more, I would say, in-migrant counties, places where we've seen the most in-migration in terms of, I would say, Flathead, where Glacier is located, and Missoula, as well as the Gallatin region, have seen really stark increases in their median home prices, and the days on the market number had been decreasing over that time period. And so you see that definitely impacting home affordability. I mean, in a place like Bozeman, where they rely a lot on outdoor recreation and tourism, the I would say the accommodation and food service industry, as well as the retail trade industry, is going to have the hardest time with recruitment and retention because those are lower wage industries. And in that area, you've seen a lot of expansion out into neighboring communities. Like we have a couple, Belgrade and Four Corners. You've seen those areas really grow. And so that kind of spread where some of those individuals could find housing. But overall, I think we may be, it may be a little too early to tell, but we may be kind of turning a corner in terms of housing availability due to some of the actions with the rising interest rates. We've seen median home price tick down just slightly over the last few months. Average home number of homes days a home has been on the market has been increasing just a little bit. So hopefully we've reached a little bit of an inflection point, but that's a little too early to tell. Yeah, and of course you see that trickle down into rent increases. About 30% of our population is renters. And so you see that those prices have increased by about 7%, but overall, we're still seeing significant affordability concerns, particularly for our low wage industries.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to keep the conversation with you as long as you have the mic. So none of you talked a lot about agriculture. It's a really important sector in all three of your states. I'm wondering if you can give our listeners just a little, a few ideas about how you see the ag sector right now. We've done our own survey work recently. It looks like farm incomes in general are high because of high commodity prices. I'm wondering if you can give us a little insight in the industry in your particular state.
Yeah, so our agriculture and natural resource that includes agriculture, mining, and utilities is certainly has a big impact on our overall GDP in the state. It's about, I believe it's about 10 to 15% of our overall GDP. That's just off the top of my head. But so it's not our largest producing industry. We do, like Joe mentioned, financial services, which includes the retail and is our largest, followed by healthcare and social assistance. But it certainly still has a large impact, particularly in the more rural areas of our state. We've seen slight declines in our GDP for agriculture, mining, and utilities over the last year or so. But overall, they've been fairly robust in terms of their growth and their production, and their employment levels are still where they were before. They're, of course, high wage occupations, particularly in mining and utilities. And so we've seen that they've had significant real wage growth, but recently over the last year or so, we've seen them be more of a drag on our economic production, as well as I will mention just briefly the transportation in Montana, we drive a lot. So we're really sensitive. We're a big state. We have to travel far anytime we're going anywhere. So it's really sensitive to fuel prices. And we've seen about a 4% drop in transportation GDP over the last year as gasoline prices have increased, although they've been coming down recently. So we expect that to tick back up again. But that also impacts like all industries in terms of trucking and shipping and rail and all that. So that impacts mining as well, and as well as agriculture. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Joe, let me go to you. What are farmers and ranchers looking? How are they looking right now, and what's their outlook?
Yeah,
in
so
South Dakota?
To build off on Amy's answer, which I think reflects a lot of what's going on here too, to some extent. So as a share of the economy, it's sort of understated in these pie charts. I'm sure Amy would say the same with GDP, because a lot of the manufacturing or the construction or the wholesale retail trade and so on would not be there were it not for agriculture. And that's certainly the case for South Dakota. So it has outsized effect relative to that pie wedge that anyone would show you. So there's that. In terms of the industry itself, you mentioned farm incomes and so on being relatively strong, and they are, and commodity prices relatively strong, and they are. And so in that sense, things are good. I would if there's anything that I think comes, as I mentioned in my talk, that comes up, there's sort of two bits and they're related. One is just land value in general and agricultural land value, as well as just residential and commercial land value rising so aggressively is a concern and an issue and certainly a topic of conversation. But the other is, of course, inflation, and not just the general sort of complaint around inflation, but I think there's really a sort of strong analytical argument folks in agriculture are making here, and that is their sort of finished goods prices, if you will, their commodity prices are flexible, sort of determined by world markets and rose as the purchasing power of money fell. But their input prices, at least for a while, did not adjust. And so things were quite good for a bit. And again, this has knock-on effects for banking, which finances the activity and so on. Things were quite good all down that supply chain. What's happening now, of course, is that these price pressures are revealing themselves on input prices. And I'm thinking fertilizer comes to mind and fuel more generally. And that's beginning to really tighten let's say, income statement positions and ultimately balance sheet positions of these producers. So in addition to the labor supply challenges, which again, sort of work through every industry in the state and certainly in agriculture, I would say now it's the issue around what's happening to input prices, and they're rising, of course, and how high will they rise, and to what extent will that sort of squeeze out the very farm income, Ron, that you rightly began the question with.
Right. Thank you, Joe. David, anything particular to add, or should I throw you a new question?
Well, I would just suggest that one of the things we're seeing up here is again some significant variation across the state in terms of overall conditions. We've had very interesting weather patterns where we've gone dry for one particular year, but then too much water the next year, cold weather impacting ranchers and spring calving and those kinds of things. And so a lot of volatility and variability. Transportation still remains an issue at times, depending on what's happening. That's been resolved somewhat, but back in the oil boom days, you couldn't get your ag products onto a train to their end location because oil was paying a premium. And so there's still those constant adjustments, but nothing much more than what we're hearing from the other states as well.
Thanks, David. So we have time for maybe one more go around. David, I'm going to start with you. All of the states here, the Dakotas and Montana, have seen some population burst of late. Earlier in North Dakota because of the oil boom, and during the pandemic, really, although Montana has been growing pretty significantly, over a steady period, but really has seen it during the pandemic, and South Dakota has really seen an influx. I'm curious if you might talk a little bit about where that comes from. In North Dakota, I think we understand. I guess I'm kind of curious from your perspective, David, what lessons have you learned from that population growth that might inform what's going on in the other states? And for Montana and South Dakota, I'm curious if your projections on economic growth have really shifted because you're seeing this influx that maybe you didn't expect 10 years ago. So let's start with you, David.
Sure. So the Cliff's notes on this are essentially we had a surge in oil that brought in working age males, in particular young, unmarried, working age males. Roughly 24 to 28 was the biggest group, but that 20 to 30 range was important as well. Once oil became more than a temporary increase, once it became clear that there was going to be a sustained increase in that activity, then you started to see adjustments in locations and family formation activities that started to then increase birth rates. And so we've seen birth rates go up. There really isn't what I would call a Bakken baby boom or anything like that, but there was a notable increase that occurred, somewhat correlated with oil prices. I think the most interesting thing that happened was they were able to keep higher than expected numbers of people here once oil turned into its first business cycle pivot. And once that happened, they found other jobs, the industry matured with other opportunities. But so even if you lost 1 out of every 3 oil workers, the fact that they married and had kids was increasing the population as well. But this does create a location issue. Every one of the states also has, we're big states with lower populations, which means, we have, I think Amy said it, we drive a lot. And so there's a lot of questions about things like, where do you locate education facilities, kindergarten seats, middle schools, high schools, those kinds of things are still out there as issues. And that kind of broader social infrastructure that the population requires to truly maintain long-term residency, I think is something that you can't talk about early enough in that regard.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to give Amy the last say on this, but I am curious if you could give us a few quick thoughts. You've seen a lot of growth there. Projections probably are similar. I'm curious how the state is thinking about that charge of that energy of population growth.
Yeah, I think it was very apparent over the last few years. I mean, Montana's always been an in-migration state, but that jump, we really felt it. I think the first place it hits is the housing market. You see, particularly for our immigrants from our western states, Washington, Oregon, and California, they're coming from higher home price markets. And so you saw a lot of all cash offers, that sort of thing, kind of anecdotally. And particularly, like I said, in our western regions, there is quite a bit of discrepancy between the western regions of the state that tend to be more populated versus our eastern region, except for the Billings area. But I would say in general, we need immigrants to address our workforce problem. Our deaths, our population, our natural change in the population fell over the last couple of years. We had fewer births than deaths, and so we needed those in-migrants to help alleviate some of our workforce shortage. So we're trying to, I think there's probably a lot of pushback among the general population to have all of these newcomers come in, but from an economic workforce development perspective, they're welcome in that perspective. So. Yeah.
With that, Amy, I appreciate the participation of all the panelists. I think a great job on all your presentations, a really engaging Q&A. And thank you for participating today. This is really helpful, and I think a good tee up to the next conversation. We're going to transition now to the next session that is with my colleague, Eric Garcia Luna, and he is going to lead a panel discussion on workforce development and labor force. So take it away, Eric. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this year's conference. My name is Eric Garcia Luna, and I'm a Regional Outreach Director here at the Minneapolis Fed. As Ron mentioned, in the next hour, we're going to hear from experts in 3 of the 9 district states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They're going to share with us their wisdom on what they're seeing in terms of population and labor force participation in each of their states. Very similar to what we saw in the previous session, each presenter is going to have 15 minutes to go over their material. We'll also save about 15 minutes for discussion at the end. And if anyone in the audience has questions for our presenters, please remember to type those in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring those. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter, Orianne Casale from the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, where she is an Assistant Director of the Labor Market Information Office. Orianne?
Well, I'll start with a quick overview of Minnesota's labor market as of November data. We have one of the tightest labor markets in the nation. In November, our unemployment rate, sorry, let me switch my slide here. Our unemployment rate was 2.3%, up from an all-time low in any state of 1.8% in June and July. And we have had since June the highest ratio of job openings to unemployed workers in the nation based on JOLTS data and on labor and unemployment data. In October, there were 3.2 jobs for every unemployed worker statewide, and that's actually been decreasing, so it had been higher. Despite this very tight labor market, Minnesota has added jobs for the last 14 months straight through November. Over the year in November, our job growth rate was 3.5% compared to 3.2% nationally. However, measuring from the beginning of the pandemic recession, we've seen slightly slower growth in the US. While the US regained all of the jobs it lost during the recession by June of last year, Minnesota was still 34,500 jobs short of our February 2020 level in November. So this first part of my presentation will focus on workforce trends. Compared to February 2020, just prior to the pandemic, we are still short almost 94,000 or 3% in our labor force. The US is short a negligible 65,000 workers. Moreover, on average in 2022, we have had about 67,000 unemployed workers monthly, which is an all-time low for Minnesota. Notwithstanding the shakeup caused by the pandemic recession, stalled growth in the labor force is a very long-term trend. You can see from this graph that the rate of growth leveled off around 2001, a direct result of an aging workforce and slowing population growth. The pandemic restrictions on immigration have also hit Minnesota hard. Over the previous decade, immigrants comprised 50% of the labor force growth in Minnesota, which has been mentioned in other presentations, but this slowed to a trickle in 2020 and 2021. Immigration numbers are back up in the first half of 2022, so we may start to recover some of that lost growth over the next few years. And just to make the point, the tight labor market is impacting all regions and all counties around the state. Comparing women and men's labor force participation and unemployment trends gives us some insight into what is underlying the overall labor force, the slowing labor force trends. So prior to the pandemic, between 2002 and 2019, so the first chunk of that graph, women's labor force participation rates and unemployment rates both fell slower than those of men. Sorry about that. During and just following the pandemic recession, November 2019 to 2021, women's labor force participation dropped more sharply than men. So that next little chunk, while women's unemployment rates rose faster. So those are these lighter lines down here. After the pandemic recession, over the year in November 2022, and that's this last whole part of this graph, so these are months rather than years, women's labor force participation has been recovering more slowly than men's, while women's unemployment has declined more quickly. So looking over the entire period, November 2002 to 2022, women's labor force participation fell 7.8 percentage points compared to 7.6 percentage points for men. Women's unemployment fell 1.2 percentage points compared to 2.5 percentage points for men. And as a result of these shifts, the number of employed women has grown 8.2% since 2002, while the number of employed men has grown 12.6% over that period. So faster growth for men. All race groups still have lower labor force participation in November 2022 than prior to the pandemic recession on a 12-month moving average basis. Hispanic Minnesotans have the highest labor force participation of the three groups, followed now by Black Minnesotans in the green line here. White Minnesotans have seen a steady decline in their labor force participation over the period and currently have the lowest labor force participation of the three groups. And this is largely driven by demographics, by age. Unemployment rates are now lower for all groups than prior to the pandemic. However, Black workers still have the highest unemployment rates coming out of the pandemic recession, although they have been dropping sharply since June. Hispanic workers also have very high unemployment rates during the recession, and although they dropped sharply coming out of the recession, they have been creeping up since June. And white workers have seen a steady decline in their unemployment rates and continue to have the lowest unemployment rates among these three race groups. And I'm focusing on these three groups because this is what we can really publish coming out of the current population survey monthly data. Employment trends by age are from quarterly workforce indicators, linked data on UI covered unemployment insurance covered workers from the Census Bureau. Over the last 3 years, all age groups lost employment between first quarter 2020 and first quarter 2022 in Minnesota, with the exception of teens age 14 to 18. This group added 8,700 workers, up 9.2% over the period. At the other end of the age spectrum, older workers age 65 plus saw the smallest decline and are almost back to their employment level prior to the pandemic. 19 to 34-year-olds saw the greatest declines over the 3 years, and the second largest declines were in the 55 to 65-year-old group. So looking at the gender and the age trends combined, we can surmise that insufficient early learning and school-age care is playing a big role in the inability of the labor force to grow, because it's hitting that middle, that sort of prime working age worker, and it's hitting women more strongly. Workers age 65 plus seem willing to continue to work despite the ongoing pandemic, probably because those who are still in the workforce at this age either have to work or really like working. And teens are taking advantage of increased employment opportunities and filling some of the vacuum left by prime working age adults who have left the labor force. These next set of slides are from my colleague Alessia Liebert's ongoing study of reemployment trends after the pandemic recession. The study tracks the reemployment outcomes of the 631,000 workers, or 20% of Minnesota's workforce, who were working in UI covered employment prior to the pandemic and applied for and received unemployment insurance during spring and summer 2020, so right during the pandemic recession. This report will be published in early February on our website if anyone wants to go and look for it. As you can see from this slide, there has been very little change in overall reemployment rates since third quarter 2020. The blue and green bars combined on this graph. However, many workers have switched employers since third quarter 2020, the lighter blue and green bars, and many fewer workers are on unemployment insurance, the yellow bars, because the broad-based pandemic programs ended in September 2021. The gray bars represent workers who no longer appear in Minnesota UI wage records. This includes people who have dropped out of the labor force for a variety of reasons, but also those who have moved out of state or into self-employment. They just don't show up in these data. As you can see, this is the group that increased the most over the year, this 22%. Reemployment outcomes vary by demographic group. Younger workers were least likely to be recalled by their employer of layoff and most likely to switch industry sector. These are also the most mobile group, with many in the gray bar likely moving out of state for school or work. For the most part, the older workers and for the most part, the older the worker, the more likely they were to be recalled and stay with their original employer, so these dark blue bars, and the less likely they were to switch employers or industries, again, the light blue and green bars. The oldest category, those over age 55, were the most likely to have dropped out of UI covered employment, probably mostly due to retirement. So this 32%. The gray bar for workers over age 55 is about 10 percentage points higher than among the total workforce, indicating that a layoff may have accelerated retirement plans for many. By race, white workers were most likely to be recalled after their layoff, while Black and mixed race workers were least likely to be recalled. On the other hand, Black, mixed race, and Hispanic workers were most likely to switch employers, with Black workers most likely to switch into a different industry sector. So that's the green 39%. This slide breaks down reemployment outcomes by industry sector of layoff. So the industry sector that the worker was laid off from back in 2020. Clinics and hospitals lead in recall rates up here at the very top. only 14% of workers who were laid off during the recession from this industry switched to a different industry. On the flip side, the nursing and residential care facilities sector, way down here, was only able to retain 31% of laid off workers, with 43%, the green, of them switching into other industry sectors. Nursing and residential care struggled with staffing levels throughout this period and has only started to see over the year job growth in the last 4 months in Minnesota, as quickly rising wages in the industry have successfully drawn in more workers. I could say a lot about this graph, but I'm going to have to leave it at that. The other thing that's not on this graph that I do want to mention is the sectors that absorb the largest share of switchers are in order: retail, trade, manufacturing, hospitals and clinics, and accommodations and food services, which, as we know, was one of the was the sector that was hardest hit by the pandemic layoffs. So this slide looks at inflation adjusted or real hourly wage outcomes of workers who changed employers compared to those who did not in this population of workers who had been laid off. Workers who changed employer were on average younger and had lower hourly earnings than those who stayed with the employer from which they were laid off. But even after adjusting for inflation, the median worker who changed employer, so these two lines here, saw stronger real wage growth than those who did not change employer, so 3.4% and 6.8%. However, the group that changed employer had greater variability in wage outcomes, this last column, with over a quarter of them experiencing a significant drop of 10% or more in their hourly wage. Finally, workers who were laid off during the pandemic recession and were reemployed in second quarter 2022 saw larger growth in real wages at 2% compared to the total workforce, and experienced close to the same amount of variability in their wage outcomes as all workers. So continuing with the theme of job switching, this is another analysis from Alessia Liebert. Here we shift focus to all payroll workers, so all workers in jobs covered by UI, economy-wide, not just those who had been laid off during the recession. This analysis compares those who switched employers and those who stayed with the same employer between 2020 and 2021, just as inflation was kicking into high gear. The green line represents the wages of job switchers, and the blue line represents the wages of workers who stayed with the same employer during this period. So you can see that workers who switched employer, the green line, saw a better wage growth and were able to beat inflation up to age 56. Workers who stayed with the same employer saw wages stagnate and real wages shrink by the age of 35. I would encourage anyone who's interested in this analysis to check out the article in our September issue of Trends. So my colleague Mustafa Hamida is working on a series of articles exploring Minnesota's wage distribution. This graph, so these next two slides are from that study. This graph looks at how the wage distribution has shifted over the last 5 years. Some of his findings from the study are that Minnesota's wage distribution has shifted to the right between 2017 and 2022, meaning that wage inequality has decreased over this period in Minnesota. Between 2017 and 2022, the median hourly wage of workers increased from $21.05 an hour to $26.14 an hour in current dollars. Wage inequality is decreasing across the distribution, but is decreasing faster at the lower half. So just some summary numbers on how much people are, what share of people are earning low wages. The share of workers making $11 or less per hour decreased from 11% in 2017 to 1.8% in 2022. And the share making 15 or less decreased from 29% to 11%, all in inflation adjusted dollars. And then my last slide shows that wages grew faster at the lower end of the distribution over the 5-year period than at the upper end overall. So in all of these 5 years. After adjusting for inflation, wages grew across the distribution from 2017 to 2022, these first 3 bars, but declined across the distribution in 2021, the dark blue here. In 2022, only workers below the 40th percentile of the wage distribution saw real wage growth, while workers at the 40th percentile and above saw real wages decline. And that's my presentation. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Oriane. I'm very interested information. Just want to make a note that we may go a little bit over the 12 p.m. end time. Everybody's welcome to stay, but we want to make sure that we hear all the intelligence that our panelists have to share. Next, I'm going to welcome Tessa Conroy. She is an economic development specialist and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics and the Department of Extension, and her focus is community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurship. With that, Tessa, it's all you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'll be doing the state labor force overview for Wisconsin. So I'll start with the same story that we have seen across all states in the 9th district, that we have really low levels of labor underutilization. So here I'm showing you U3 and U6. So our conventional measure of unemployment, as well as an alternative measure of unemployment for Wisconsin, and then how those compare to the United States. And here in Wisconsin, we're looking at an unemployment rate between 3 and 3.5%. So we're also experiencing tight labor markets here, and tight labor markets even compared to the average experience across the country. And I just want to point out with this alternative measure of unemployment that's including the marginally attached workers, that these are people that I think might be the low-hanging fruit in terms of engaging more people in work. These are people that say they want a job but haven't been looking in the last 12 months for a number of reasons, but even those numbers are coming down. I also want to point out that even though unemployment is low, it does vary quite a bit by race. And we saw this as well with Oriane's slides. So unemployment rate by race, here we have Wisconsin 2022 Q3, and we're looking at a relatively low white unemployment rate at 2.6%, much higher for the Black population at 6.3, also higher for Hispanics at 3.6, closer to 2.7 for the Asian and Pacific Islander. The gap between white and Black in Wisconsin is significant, and I think I want to draw more attention to it by also looking at the long run trend, that this is a remarkably persistent gap in the unemployment rates, and I think a challenge for us to be considering here in Wisconsin, particularly placed in context of how it looks with the rest of the country. So here we're mapping the Black to white unemployment rates across the country. Again, this is Q3 from 2022. Wisconsin here with a relatively high ratio compared to a lot of states. I think as recently as Q2, we had one of the highest ratios of Black to white unemployment rates. So really big differences here, also coupled with large racial differences in wages and earnings. This makes Wisconsin a place with a really significant racial disparity challenge in the labor market that we need to be considering. Coming back though to the topic of a tight labor market, certainly we have a tight labor market, but when I look at this data, I would say it's not because people aren't working. People are working. In the summer of 2022, we had as high of engagement in the labor force in Wisconsin as we've basically ever had. So we are seeing those people engaged in the labor force. And taking then another closer look at marginally attached workers. Marginally attached workers, again, we might think of these as the people who could or should be working. They say they would like a job, but for some reason have stopped their search. So these are discouraged workers. These are people experiencing some sort of barrier to unemployment. And I just want to connect with Amy's work that she was discussing in the prior session on the importance of childcare. These discouraged workers are going to, excuse me, not discouraged workers, these marginally attached workers could be those that indicate they would like to be working, but they are experiencing a childcare barrier. And anecdotally, as well as empirically, we're seeing that this childcare challenge is really important in Wisconsin, a big barrier for parents of young children, especially mothers of young children. So we tend to see large differences, or maybe I shouldn't say large, but noticeable differences in labor force participation rates between men and women in those prime age years. And we might attribute some of that to the childcare challenge. So when we're thinking about how do we engage more workers in the workforce, thinking about who are those populations that have barriers, I think that those parents of young children are certainly one of them. So if people are working, what is this tight labor market? Certainly demand is very high. That's what we're seeing right now. So here we have a graph of unemployed persons per job opening in Wisconsin. So given that there's a job that needs to be filled, how many people do we have who are looking for work available to fill that position? And in Wisconsin, we're well under one person per job opening. So these are very tight labor markets. There was a time, particularly in the years following the Great Recession, where we had lots of workers competing just for one job opening. And the labor market has really kind of turned on its head in that sense, of course, that we're back to talking about a tight labor market. We're back to talking about now employers competing to get workers rather than workers competing to get a job. And I think that you see that here pretty clearly looking at this ratio of unemployed persons to job opening. I think another reason the labor market is tight, again, this is a theme throughout presentations, is because the population is aging, particularly in rural labor markets, I would say. So here we have the prime age population, and we focus on the prime age just because that's the meat of our labor force. That tends to be where we see labor force participation rates be the highest. So the prime age population from 25 to 54, now we're looking at starting in 2010 and then taking projections going forward to 2040. And what we see is that prime age share of the population is declining. So our baby boomers exiting the labor force, people aging out of the labor force, and that's just making that chunk of workers who are so central to filling positions a little bit smaller relative to the rest of the population. And looking at the difference between urban and rural declining in both places, but the gap between rural and urban in Wisconsin getting bigger over time. So I expect this to be a particularly acute challenge in rural areas. I want to pivot a little bit from maybe thinking about the labor force in the conventional terms and talk a little bit about the self-employed, about entrepreneurs, about the workers who are making a living by working for themselves. And during the pandemic, we saw some really interesting trends in entrepreneurship. So what I'm showing you here are the business application data. So in case you're not familiar, a business application is an application for an employer identification number. It's a lot like a social security number for businesses. They're going to need that number to file their payroll taxes when they hire employees. But businesses might also need this number to open a business banking account, to fill out regulatory forms at the state level, for example. So we expect most businesses to need an application number. However, they might get this number early in the process. So we consider this an early indicator of entrepreneurial activity, or as I'm calling it here, this is a measure of entrepreneurial intent, people who intend to start a business. And prior to the pandemic in Wisconsin, we hovered around 3,000 to 4,000 business applications per month. And then that really accelerated during the pandemic. We did have a short downturn in those first few months, March, April, May, but by July of 2020, and that's what you're seeing for the high point, we had more business application activity than we'd ever seen. Since March of 2020, we've had close to 170,000 business applications in the state. Some of those, of course, would have happened anyway, pandemic or no pandemic. But even then, we have upwards of 50,000 sort of extra business applications in this period coming out of during and coming out of the pandemic. So I think this is, really exciting. We're talking about people starting businesses, people making a living for themselves. It seems that there is a lot of this type of intention out in the workforce right now. In terms of what this looks like year over year for Wisconsin and the surrounding states, so we have annual growth in business applications, and we see that those business applications have been growing and remain elevated. So growth, though, has stalled. So they accelerated during 2020, became much higher than we'd seen prior, and have stayed high at that level since. Maybe starting to decline a little bit in some places, across states, but still staying at that relatively high level. Even when you look around Wisconsin, so by county, it's true that there's a lot of variation, but it's still the case that we have elevated entrepreneurial activity for the most part across the state. So business applications were up 40% on average in 2022 compared to 2019. So that last sort of normal year, if you will, before the pandemic. So we're seeing this across the state, and again, rural and urban. And I think that this could be a positive signal for economic development across the state. So far, I've talked to you about business applications, but now we're going to be looking at business formations. So of those business applications that come in, people wanting that employer identification number, how many of them actually go on to create a fully formed business within 2 years? And I want to be clear that to be counted as forming a business, you have to hire your first employees. So we have all of this entrepreneurial activity. How many of those businesses actually open? So upwards of, we saw, I think, 5,000 business applications per month. And we see that the actual number of businesses that form is a lot smaller. So before the pandemic, between 300 and 400 businesses arising out of that big pool of business applications. But this is specifically businesses that hire employees, keep in mind. I think these businesses are exciting because these are our job creators. These are businesses that are, again, hiring those first employees, creating new jobs over and above what we've had before. So when we look at what is expected to happen, these are based on projections because we have to give those businesses some time to actually open their doors. But we do expect to see upwards of 30% more businesses opening their doors, becoming fully formed based on that increase in business application data. I think what's interesting, though, is the sort of long-term trend in what we see happening in that conversion rate. So of those that apply for the application, how many become fully formed? In general, we see a conversion rate between 10 and 15%, but there's been this long run decline. So we see fewer and fewer businesses hiring their first employees and being counted as fully formed in that way. That said, I think that this undercounts business activity because we're not including the non-employer businesses. And the non-employer businesses are a large and growing section of the business community. So in Wisconsin, non-employer establishments make up about 3/4 of the business community, a smaller share of sales and employment, of course, but really large in number. And when you look at where the growth is happening in Wisconsin, and this is true in other states that I've looked at, we've had really modest growth in employer establishments, but quite impressive growth or quite noticeable growth of non-employer establishments. Some recent work from the Federal Reserve of New York says about 17% of the workforce is earning income, either supplementing or as their primary source of income from these non-employer businesses. So I think this is an important section of the business community that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention because they're not the job creators in the way that we often focus on. But these businesses are creating at least one job, a job from themselves. They're growing in number. We see this being an important path, and there's some early work that I'm doing that suggests that this is a particularly important path for people of color entering into entrepreneurial activity. So given this information on business applications and these business formations, I've been puzzling over what this means for self-employment. So with one data set, we're keeping track of businesses, and with this other data set, the current population survey, we're keeping track of people. And is it the case that we would see as entrepreneurial intent rises, that we would also see self-employment rise? So as we see business activity rise, would we see more and more people identifying as self-employed? And I was surprised to see for the 9th District states that this is actually remarkably stable, I would say. There's fluctuations, sure, but one of the trends when I look at these data that I'm interested in keeping an eye on is the composition. So even if the number of self-employed is the same, so maybe it's the case that the people who are entrepreneurs have always been entrepreneurs, but they're changing the way they do business. And that might be showing up here in terms of the incorporated versus unincorporated share of self-employed. So the incorporated tends to be the more formal. They tend to have a better trajectory in terms of growth. And is it the case that with the pandemic, we saw more people taking steps to formalize some activities that they were already involved in, applying for that employer identification number, and that's shifting the way that we think of, or that we experience self-employment. And so that's something that I'm keeping an eye on. I think it's a little bit soon to tell, but as you can see, there is this slight uptick in the share of incorporated self-employment in the 9th District, and that's something that I will be watching going forward. With that, I want to thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion at the end.
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting angle to the conversation. Next, I'm going to welcome Rochelle Winkler, who is a professor of sociology and demography at Michigan Tech. Her research focuses on rural community well-being and spatial inequalities. Much of her work examines migration within the United States and how it relates to community well-being, including social, economic, and environmental factors. Rochelle, thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, you're good.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me to share with you all today. I'm going to take a broad look at the labor force, focusing on demographic changes with some thinking about what that means for past, present, and future labor force. So I want to start by recognizing Julia Peterson, who contributed to developing several of these slides, who works with me on this work. And I want to also start by looking historically for a moment. The population in the UP peaked 100 years ago in 1920. And I think that's important context to just keep in mind. Since then, the population's modestly declined in most decades, and that loss was primarily driven by outmigration, much of which was associated with closures of mines or military bases, mills, or other large employers. So historically, we've really seen population respond to contraction of employment opportunities. But more recently, population change has been less directly connected to employment. For one, decline has increasingly been because of natural decrease or having more deaths than births rather than migration. And a lot of that has to do with aging, which I'm going to spend a good chunk of time on. And then also on the migration side, we're seeing in some places that people are moving into the UP for more natural and cultural amenities and working remotely or starting their own businesses in ways that are not tied to employment or people leaving, and sometimes also people leaving for more urban cultural or amenities, even when there are local jobs available at times. So a little bit of a mismatch there. Looking just at the last decade and breaking population change down by county, we see that only Houghton County experienced population growth in the last decade. Some of the counties that experienced the greatest percent population loss, like Gogebic and Ontonagon counties especially, have consistently experienced quite dramatic population loss for decades. And that's primarily driven by outmigration of young adults. In those counties in particular, we've seen a really dramatic contraction of the labor force that's been ongoing for 60 years. So I said before that most of this change historically was driven by migration out of the region, and I want to look at some data on that now. If we look at migration patterns that are broken down by age in particular, we can get a better understanding of how it impacts the labor force. So I'm going to give you all a special little sneak peek at some data that aren't even released yet, but that we've been working on. These are net migration estimates by age for US counties for the time period between 2010 and 2020. And you can find similar data for each decade going all the way back to the 1950s for all counties at this website URL that you'll see on the screen here. But the 2010 to 2020 data, we're still working on finalizing and getting incorporated into the website. So we expect that those will be added this April. So more is coming soon, but in this snapshot that you see here in the image, it's net migration for counties across the district, with oranges indicating net out migration and the white and purples indicating net in migration. So in this map, we see totals, but it is possible to break this down by age, sex, and race and ethnicity. So it's a data source that you all might be interested in. And I encourage you to play around with the website, and you can make interactive charts or maps for your own areas of interest or download data. And to show you some of that new data in this chart, I'm using those age data, and it shows the estimated number of net migrants by 5-year age group in each decade, going back to the 1950s through 2020 for the UP. You have younger ages on the left, older ages on the right. Everything above that 0 line is positive net in migration and at those ages. And then below that 0 line represents net out migration. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, those solid light blue lines, the region experienced net out migration of almost every age group. Since the 1970s, the region has generally experienced net gains at traditional college ages. And this is associated with the fact that UP universities attract students from out of the region. And these universities really started to grow more in the 1970s. And in the most recent decade, these gains were particularly large. So attracting a net gain of about 8,000 college-age young people in that 10-year age group. After graduation, though, many of those students and other young adults leave the region, and we see net out migration in the most recent decades of about 12,000 young adults. So still seeing more net loss than those that come in. But I see this, I want to point this out because I see it as both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, the talent is there in the region, they're there for a university. The challenge is to keep more of them there for the labor force. We do see some net positive also at retirement ages across the UP. But together, this like net loss of young people for decade after decade after decade and net gains among older adults really leads to population aging. And that aging has also led to a situation where population is declining now across the region, as much because of natural decrease or more deaths than births than outmigration. In the last decade, more than half of the region's population loss was because of natural decrease, as we can see in the pie chart here. If we look at that natural population change for each county in the bar chart, we see only Houghton County saw more births than deaths. And in some counties, that difference between births and deaths is quite large. We can expect that these changes will continue into the future as we see population age even further. Even more recently, since 2020 and the onset of COVID-19, we see even more natural decrease in the UP and really across the whole district and around the country. Every county in the UP had more deaths than births in the last 2 years. But this was also more broadly true, with over 2/3 of the nation's counties had natural decrease in 2021. So aging is a really central part of the story in the UP. It's why we see the natural decrease. It also has dramatic impacts on the labor force. Our labor force participation rates in the UP by county range from less than 40% in Alger County up to 59% is the highest one we've got in Marquette County. So these are very low, and this corresponds closely with median age. In 2021, the median age was over 50 years old in 6 of the 15 UP counties. It was over 44 years in another 6 counties. And this compares to about 38 years for the nation as a whole, so dramatically older. In those 3 counties in the UP that have a large university presence, Houghton, Marquette, and Chippewa counties, they're younger. But also interesting is the labor force participation rates are a little bit higher. And I think that's interesting because even though we know like a large portion of these people are young people who are full-time students, but yeah, we still see some higher labor force participation there, although it's still low really across the region. At the same time as we see low labor force participation, we also see relatively high unemployment in the UP compared to the rest of the district, certainly, and also compared to the nation. Unemployment rates have dropped in the last couple of years in the UP, but not to the same extent that we've seen elsewhere that we've heard our colleagues talk about today. And we have seen a tighter labor market though in the last few years, I would also say, especially for skilled workers, workers in the trades, and workers with specific talent. So all of this suggests that there is some kind of a mismatch between the job opportunities that are available and the kinds of skills that our labor has, the kinds of flexibility that may or not be present, and or spatial mismatch with exactly where people are living. So far, I've painted kind of a gloomy story for the UP in terms of the labor force, but we do see some promising new patterns related to pandemic migration, remote workers, and university students that I'd like to touch on. So we've been doing research on how what had been typical migration patterns around the country really have changed since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're primarily using data from the US Postal Service change of address forms, and we look within UP counties and compare the months prior to the pandemic to the months after the pandemic. And we find that migration out of the UP has really slowed down during the pandemic. And this is true across rural America. So UP residents stayed in place more is really the story. Migration into the UP also slowed down, but less so than the out migration. And this means that there was less population loss during the pandemic since what we were seeing prior to the pandemic. To show this in a little more detail, these are Postal Service data for the UP counties or for UP zip codes. And they show that in those 3 years prior to the pandemic, on the left, the UP was losing about 6,500 net migrants each year. But since the pandemic onset, this loss was reduced to about 30,000 a year, so less than half the typical. And then there's a big but here. We know that this particular data source is not perfect. And in particular, one of the ways that it does poorly is in estimated college students. So we know that it doesn't capture the college students coming in, but it does tend to capture them leaving. And since the UP migration patterns are so driven by college students, especially in the largest population counties, we know that these numbers here are too negative, but they do give us a good sense of that change during the pandemic. So we get a better overall picture by looking at the Census Bureau population estimates of net migration. And here with these data, we see a shift toward positive net migration since the pandemic started in all but one UP county. And that one is Menominee County with only a very small net loss. So this, I just want to point out, this is a huge difference compared to really quite consistent net out migration over the last 60 years in the UP. So we hear a lot of stories about people moving into rural areas to escape cities during the pandemic, but I want to emphasize here that that is not really what's going on. There has always been some people moving to the UP for cities from decades, but the big difference here is that fewer people left. Still, the shift to remote work possibilities is making it more possible for folks to move to the UP in ways that aren't directly connected to employment opportunities. And this is just one example of an initiative called Remote Workforce Keweenaw. Basically, it's a website. It's primarily driven by one guy, but they've connected to local community and economic development groups. They have a website, they have a blog, they're on social media, they're regularly publishing stuff and trying to do really two main things. One, they're trying to reach out to people elsewhere to capture their interest in moving to the UP and provide them some information to facilitate them being able to do that. And two, they're trying to connect remote workers that are here already within the region so that they can build social and community networks, and they're more likely to stay to contribute to local community and economic development opportunities, and to connect them to local in-person work opportunities as well. And just this organization is currently tracking over 160 remote workers since they started in the last 3 years, just in Houghton and Keweenaw counties, which are pretty small population places. So to kind of summarize what I think all this means for the labor market in the UP and beyond, really, the labor market's shrinking in large part due to slower population growth and aging across the United States, but especially in the Midwest. And this is even more pronounced in the UP, and then even more pronounced in those UP counties that are outside of those most populous counties that are also home to larger universities. And the fact that this is widespread makes it even more difficult to address. You can't recruit from outside if you all have the same problem. And this speaks to something that we heard in the initial fireside conversation, that immigration increasingly becomes important in this context. We do also see some pandemic related changes that are generally positive for the UP in terms of, changing some very long-term patterns of out-migration. But there are questions. Will these stuck locals stay? Will they take local jobs? Will they gain the right skills? Will the pandemic migrants who are coming in, will they stay? And will they take local jobs? And we don't really know the answers to those questions yet. Also, I think there's a real opportunity in the growing numbers of university students who come to the UP. And the question remains, what can we do to keep more of this talent in the region? And then some challenges too, as others have talked about today, that there are real challenges in the UP with housing shortages. Housing costs have increased here just like they have elsewhere, but they generally remain quite low relative to other places. The real problem in the UP is a lack of rental housing and a lack of quality housing. In the Western UP, for instance, about 40% of housing units were built before 1940. And across the region, the history of outmigration and relatively low income has created a situation where there's been almost a century of disinvestment in housing, and that's catching up with us now. And then finally, as we heard from Amy in Montana and others more recently, in the UP is also a childcare desert really across the region, and particularly in terms of licensed childcare with regular access to childcare. And this has been a problem for a long time, but was really exacerbated by the pandemic. So thank you very much. Happy to consider questions.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. You ended in a very good segue slide right there. We're hearing from a lot of employers themselves that they are struggling to find the talent, but at the same time, as you alluded, there are workers out there that may be looking for employment. And I'm just wondering, what employers are doing in order to attract that talent, to keep that talent, besides the menu of items that you talked about, anything from housing to childcare. What are employers doing in order to address the labor shortage?
I mean, I can just speak to a couple of more local initiatives that I know of what's going on. So one thing that we see in the Keweenaw region in the western part of the UP is our biggest local employers have really started to work closely with local community and economic development leaders, meeting regularly with, this is just one example, a group called Team Peninsula that has decided to really come together as a collective and invest in trying to address some of these challenges. So they're focusing hard on housing and childcare. They're also trying to think about ways of attracting more people to the region. They've been a big sponsor of this Remote Workforce Keweenaw initiative that I mentioned, and also thinking about trying to make the UP a welcoming place for immigrants and finding ways to do that. So that's just one example.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Now I'm gonna double check on that. Great. Tessa, I wonder if you could, shed some light on that same issue. What are employers doing in order to address that from their standpoint?
Excuse me, similar to Rochelle, I think we're seeing employers realize that particularly with an issue like childcare, we might have used to think of that as a household issue or a family issue or even a women's issue. And I think now we're starting to see it as an economic issue, as a labor force issue. And employers are thinking about ways that they can be part of the solution. And we've engaged with employers kind of across the spectrum. There are employers that are in a position and have the resources to say, like, well, what would it take for me to open a childcare, and how do I support our community in that way? And then there are employers who maybe aren't in a position to, run a full-fledged childcare, but say, I have facilities, so I can offer facilities to the problem. We're seeing anchor institutions get involved in a way that is, I think, new and exciting. Hospitals coming to the table wanting to discuss childcare, schools coming to the table wanting to discuss childcare. We're seeing lots of community action groups on childcare, different ways of using grant funding to reduce barriers, to engage community members. So it looks a little bit different wherever you go in Wisconsin in terms of employer involvement, community leadership, but I definitely see a lot of movement on childcare, and I would agree that housing is another space where we have communities coming together, doing workshops, thinking about what does it take to have housing such that the people who work here can live here.
That's great, thank you. And I'll go to Oriane.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that employers are doing right now is trying to raise wages to the extent that they can. Obviously, that ability differs across industries and across employers, but employers who are raising wages seem to be having more success in attracting workers. I mean, I think residential care facilities is a good example. They were losing workers until they were able to raise wages, and now they've seen a complete turnaround in that, and they're beginning to grow again. In terms of childcare, I think employers and others are beginning to see childcare as an economic development issue. We, as a state, are funding childcare in terms of economic development. I think employers individually have a very hard time, like, really doing that much themselves about childcare, because childcare is a very challenging kind of business to run. But they're, I think, more supportive overall of seeing that as more of an economic development issue. And I think the other last thing I want to mention is that communities are really trying to figure out how to be more welcoming to new residents, and in all different ways, housing and others, but just making people feel like they're part of the community when they move in.
That's great, thank you. And we did hear a little bit about immigration earlier today. We've been hearing that actually throughout the presentation. So I think your statement is right on. So I think Tessa, you expanded a little bit on the entrepreneurial part of these, the opportunities that many are possibly finding. They're pivoting possibly from employment and trying to become more entrepreneurial. What are some of those businesses that they may be going into that you're seeing the most? And I after you answer, I'd be curious to hear if Rochelle or Oriane are seeing some similar stuff.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of activity, particularly in online retail. So it does seem to be the case that people are developing online businesses. That's a big chunk of that new activity. Also, a lot of opportunity in transportation and warehousing. I think over the last couple of years, when you look at kind of where these business applications are happening nationally, there's been a lot of shifts in how we deliver things, how we get goods from one place to another. And I think with that has come new opportunity. And so those are the two categories where I see a lot of activity in terms of opportunity. But when we look at those business applications and the sectors or industries, it's all across the board. There isn't a sector industry that's sort of been untouched by this entrepreneurial intent, which I find interesting and encouraging at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just a quick follow-up right there. I wonder if you know what the, if there's like a specific ethnic group or a specific industry that those individuals are, leaving their employment from, not so much what they're opening as a business, right? But where are they coming from? And just curious to see if you have any insights into that.
I wish we knew. I think that there's reason to believe that some people entered into maybe a more entrepreneurial state of mind out of necessity, that, in those more dire months of the pandemic, people having to find or create new employment for themselves. And so whatever their past job was, they, don't have that anymore. So now they're, self-employed. I think, though, that also the pandemic had circumstances such that we were also maybe reevaluating our work and why am I doing what I'm doing when I've always had this goal of pursuing X, Y, or Z pursuit. And so I think there's also, at least anecdotally, there's this people have been emboldened to pursue their passions. And so again, that's also coming across a variety of sectors.
Yeah, we as we did our work ourselves, we kept hearing that. So that's something that we're definitely familiar with it. Oriana, I'll go to you. Just anything to add on that front?
I don't have that much to add. I think that the only thing I will add is I think people have seen the pandemic as, post-pandemic as an opportunity to pursue their dreams and passions, and the contraction in the service sector might have given a lot of people opportunities to kind of fill the void of businesses that closed.
Great. And I know we're right at the noon hour, so I said we will stick around for a little bit more just to make up for time. Rochelle, anything to add?
I don't have much to add. I would say one thing that we're seeing in the UP in particular, because we, as I mentioned, the population and the infrastructure really peaked here back in 1920. And so we remain in a situation across much of the UP where there are a lot of open buildings, open space that have been relatively low rent. And so one of the things that we've had with entrepreneurial activity is people starting to come in and fill those spaces, redevelop those spaces. It requires a big investment to redevelop some of these spaces that have seen disinvestment for too long, but a lot of these places were built in a magnificent kind of fashion and just need some real love and care. And we're seeing more and more entrepreneurs start to reinvest in some of those spaces and reinvent them.
Great. Just final thoughts on this next question. We'll wrap it up. As you know, many refer to today's labor market as one where workers, have the upper hand. You talked a little bit about that. I wonder if you think that's truly the case, and what opportunities are there for, the economy as a whole to kind of address that mismatch of demand and supply of workers. And I'll start with Tessa.
So again, given the trends in inflation and I think some uncertainty about where the economy is headed, I can see where this is changing, but I do think workers maybe over the last year or so have been in a different position, of course, than during the pandemic. And we sort of returned to those late kind of 2019 types of conversations where workers were feeling like they were in a position to seek some of the work amenities that maybe they hadn't had but prefer. So yes, it's higher wages, but it's not just that. Workers maybe are in a position where they want a little bit more control over their hours, both in terms of maybe they feel like they're not getting enough hours or they're working too many, or they want flexibility. And we see flexibility really entering into those conversations for the parents of young children. So this segment of the labor force that potentially has a lot of barriers. So I don't think it's, there was kind of conversations about, oh, a great resignation or all of these people quitting. And I am of the perspective that this is really maybe a story more of workers taking advantage of opportunities to improve their employment situation and seek out some of those job attributes that are really important to them, including wages, but lots of other things as well.
No, that's great. And Oriane?
Well, I think from our research, we are seeing that workers do have a little more, especially lower wage workers and younger workers do have a little more power in this economy, particularly workers who are willing to switch jobs and employers. And that obviously isn't, all workers. So we're seeing, again, as the wage distribution research shows, we're seeing some improvements at the lower end, which is, I think, a very positive development.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Rochelle?
I don't have much to add on that one. I think it's hard to say. I don't feel like I can really make a strong claim on that one, particularly in the UP. A lot of the state data that we might look at, just are not relevant in the UP. So.
No, that is fair. And with that, I don't know, I'm just going to open it generally for any final thoughts you may have. And if you don't have any thoughts, then we'll just wrap it up and give you your day back. Anyone? We're good. Well, with that, I want to thank you so much. And I want to thank all the panelists and participants for taking the time to join us for today's conference. We're very grateful, and we hope that you all found today's conference valuable. The slide decks, I know that somebody asked that question, will be available. They're going to be available to all of you. And we ask that you also please take a minute to fill out a brief survey that will pop up in your Zoom window upon exiting. So thank you again, and just have a great weekend.